My brother made a post falsely accusing me of abusing him and our parents. I found something he wrote back in January 2021 when my parents kicked me and my partner out during the height of COVID, before vaccines were available to me. I want to discuss this because it shows how siblings can deceive themselves and others about the scapegoat in the family. I moved back in with my parents in April 2018, long before January 2021, after my boyfriend at the time held me hostage and tried to kill me. This happened after almost a year of severe physical and emotional abuse. We had been dating for about a year and a half. Also, I didn't move in my new boyfriend right away. I started dating my current partner soon after my breakup, and it was a bit chaotic. I talked about it with my therapist, who was initially cautious but eventually supported the relationship because it was healthy. We took things slowly to ensure I was mentally okay. Despite my feelings, my mom asked my partner to move in after we had only been dating for 4 months. I wasn't ready, but he ended up moving in a few months later. At the end of 2018 or early 2019, when I felt more comfortable, by the end of 2019, my parents also had my partner pay rent, so he was paying rent when my brother wrote his post. Additionally, we weren't living in a garage. We were in a large studio apartment with a big bedroom and an attached bathroom, the laundry room connected to the house, and you had to go up 3 steps to get to the kitchen. My parents have a separate 3-car garage, so I don't understand why he lied about that. We also weren't doing hard drugs or drinking excessively. During family dinners, my mom liked to share a bottle of wine, but my partner and I didn't get drunk. Sometimes I drank a bit more with my mom, and we both got tipsy, but it wasn't excessive. We didn't stay up all night and sleep all day. I had just transferred to UCLA for the 2020-21 school year and was attending classes remotely in January 2021. I was taking 20 credits, which was the most I had ever taken at once. Most of my classes required me to attend with cameras on, which was tough when my parents cut off the internet. I got a mobile hotspot through a program that UCLA offered during COVID, which helped a lot. Before the lockdowns, my partner worked full-time as a bartender, mostly during the mornings at a hotel bar. I was busy with school, and my partner mostly kept me company while I attended classes. So, my brother is right that we didn't spend a lot of time in the main house with my family. I don't smoke cigarettes, but my partner does. He would step out to the edge of the property, which is in the middle of a field, to smoke and always disposed of his cigarette butts in the bin my parents put out for the garbage truck. Interestingly, my brother used to smoke too, even after quitting. He often asked my partner for cigarettes when he was at our parents' house. It's absurd for my brother to say I've taken advantage of my parents. They only paid my rent once for 3 months when I was 19. Trying to make amends after kicking me out at 17 while I was still in high school. We didn't speak for over a year after that. Meanwhile, my parents have always paid my brother's rent because he's the favored child. I can't even remember the last time he had a job. Regarding the manipulative or abusive behavior my brother claims I displayed, I honestly don't recall ever planning dinner with my parents and not showing up. It's possible it happened while I was with my abusive ex, but I don't remember it. I think I canceled brunch once at the last minute, but my parents have canceled on me too. They weren't very reliable about anything in my life. As for my brother saying I screamed at him when I was late for something, I know we argued when I visited him in 2019, but there was no screaming involved. At that time, I was taking remote summer classes. I was also dealing with court issues related to the criminal case against my ex, which was really stressful. My brother wanted me to visit because he said he was feeling depressed and missed me, so I traveled out of state to see him for almost a week. However, he kept coming to the Airbnb where my partner and I were staying hours before our agreed meeting time. I was busy working on school assignments and communicating with the assistant DA about the case. He got mad that I wasn't ready to go out, even though he came over hours early. For example, he would show up at 10 a.m. when we were supposed to meet at 3 p.m. Remember, I had just escaped a very bad breakup where my ex tried to kill me. After escaping, I ended up in the hospital because my ex had smashed my phone with a hammer. I needed to call someone for a ride, and since I didn't have my aunt's number memorized, I called my mom to get it for me. She said she'd call my aunt and not to worry, which annoyed me a bit since I just wanted my aunt's number. My ex had strangled me multiple times, causing me to lose consciousness and suffer a severe concussion, so I didn't remember much from that time. I wasn't trying to fix my relationship with my parents. They were pretty aggressive about me moving back in with them. I didn't expect them to show up, because it wasn't the first time they found out about my ex's abuse. The last time they said they would come, they didn't actually show up. After moving back in, I started therapy within 3 weeks and was diagnosed with severe PTSD. Yes, I sometimes had panic attacks, but that was because I had been severely abused for a long time. The DA charged my ex with torture, kidnapping, and several other violent felonies because of what he did to me. During that weekend, I was working hard to improve my mental health and felt I was making great progress. It's really frustrating for my brother to make it seem like I was being abusive or hostile when I needed to step away to manage my panic attacks or flashbacks. My brother and I had been going through a rough patch in our relationship because he was often uncaring and selfish. He never asked me how I was handling the court situation and was just focused on himself. While we were having family dinners most nights, we got into an argument about a social justice issue, which I'll simplify for now. I was telling my brother that no one deserves to be homeless because he was advocating for a family to lose their house. It felt really strange, and I got overwhelmed and needed to walk away. As I left, he made a snide remark saying I didn't care enough about our relationship. My partner got angry on my behalf and told my brother he was being ridiculous as we walked down the stairs to the laundry room. This made my brother very angry, and I later learned that he was likely detoxing after a months-long crack and heroin binge and was only a couple of weeks clean. He then started yelling at my partner for disrespecting him in his house, even though my brother didn't live there anymore and my partner did. My dad was there encouraging the argument while my partner kept telling my brother to calm down and that he didn't want to engage. My brother then called my partner a slur. When my mom walked in and asked what was happening, my partner stepped away as soon as my brother got in his face. My parents had told me I could stay, but my partner had to go, so my brother is wrong about them wanting us both out. My dad didn't like my partner because he helped me see how toxic their behavior was, which made me more confident and independent. My dad hated that. I also have outside confirmation of their toxic behavior. At the start of the COVID lockdowns, my therapist suggested I move out because my parents weren't good for my mental health. This shocked me because I didn't think I had ever told her anything negative about them. I even told my parents they were as good as dead to me, and my dad responded by saying they could actually die from COVID. To which I said I wouldn't care if they did. I stand by that. They have been so abusive to me my whole life. After I left, they put my dog down. She was older but didn't need to be put down, and they wouldn't let me take her. I'll never forgive them for that. It's really messed up because they got a new dog that looks a lot like her and keeps sending me pictures, even though I've been no contact since they kicked us out. My brother is also leaving out some key details. He once told me he hoped my current partner would abuse me when we moved out. And I responded by saying I hoped he would die of an overdose. Then he told me he hoped I would kill myself. I'm not saying I handled everything perfectly. I was very emotional and volatile, but I had reasons to be. They took the doors off our room, turned off our water for days, and wouldn't let us access our food. These conversations happened while I was trying to pack my things from my childhood bedroom, and my brother was standing in the doorway verbally berating me. While visiting for Christmas, my brother had moved into the main part of the house and stayed in a storage room connected to our bathroom. He blasted electronic music 24/7 for several days, and while his room was locked, it had a sliding glass door, so we could see. He pointed the speakers directly at our room. It was clearly meant to make it harder for us to sleep, talk, or for me to study. I couldn't turn my mic on during any of my classes, and my brother only turned it off when we called the cops, twice. The "look at how this is affecting mom" comment came while he was throwing my packed things at me, and I was crying, asking him to just leave me alone. At that point, my partner and I were completely packed, except for a few items stored in the garage. My parents had promised to get those down from the rafters, but they refused to do it until the next day, even though we already had the U-Haul packed and an Airbnb rented. That's why we called the cops again. They were withholding my belongings and stopping us from leaving. The only pattern here is that my parents kicked me out as a kid and did it again recently. I had never said anything as hurtful as what I said during this incident. I was just done with being treated badly. I stand by my feeling that they are all dead to me. My extended family supports my decision to cut ties with them. My brother claiming I have no friends is really hurtful and untrue. I lost some friends during my abusive relationship, which is common in those situations. Plus, my brother doesn't have many friends either, so he's in no position to judge. I don't live in my own world and have never lied to him, so I don't understand why he calls me a compulsive liar. I don't think he knows what sociopath means either. He also asked if I tell my parents they need to let her go. I've been trying to have a relationship with my mom for years, but it's always been toxic. My mom just wants our family to be okay, and she's really hurt by all of this. I'm trying to figure out my best option in this situation. I've never heard someone say such horrible things to a loved one. Before all this, I had stopped talking to my brother for about a year because I was hurt by how he treated me. Just 2 weeks before everything happened, he apologized for being selfish and not being there for me during the stuff with my ex. I later found out from my aunt that he probably reached out because his girlfriend of about 4 years broke up with him. In our relationship, he always expected me to be his therapist, which seems to be a pattern. Sorry for the long post. I hope pointing out all the ways this is wrong might help me stay no contact.
"Well, Carly O'Donnell, accept the keys to your new life," said Mrs. Pollock, placing a lightweight set of 3 keys on a metal ring into her narrow palm. The girl hesitated in front of the apartment door, prompting Mrs. Pollock to laugh and unlock the door herself. "Oh, Carly, you're like a newcomer. This is your new apartment. Live, be happy, start a new life. Don't be so timid. Come in." The woman opened the door, nudged Carly into the room, and then closed the door behind them. "I can't believe it, Mrs. Pollock," Carly responded shyly, following the woman down the corridor. "I guess I'm an adult now. I can live as I want and do what I want," the girl said, beginning to grasp what adulthood felt like. "Exactly," Mrs. Pollock said cheerfully, draping an arm around Carly's shoulders. "You're a grown-up now, so you can become independent. But," Mrs. Pollock raised a finger meaningfully, "there's a caveat about doing what you want. My girl," she said in a more serious tone, "being an adult and being in charge of your life doesn't mean you can thoughtlessly do whatever you want. Adulthood means making responsible decisions and always taking responsibility for your life. Understand this. There may be people who will try to sway you with false values and manipulate your thoughts. To distinguish the false from the true, always remember what I've taught you over the years. Do you understand what I'm saying now?" Carly nodded. Mrs. Pollock had indeed been like a mother figure for her and many other children in the orphanage for years. Carly never knew her father, and her memories of her mother were vague and unclear after so many years. Her mother, Lily, was deprived of her parental rights when Carly was just 5 years old. The woman used to disappear for days, leaving young Carly alone without food. If the girl was lucky, she arranged for Mrs. Ross, the neighbour, to look after little Carly during her absences. Attempts to persuade or scold Lily were futile. Hearing her address reproaches, the woman always became furious and began to lash out with profanity at Mrs. Ross, Carly, and the world that tried to force her to deny her desires. And her winning argument, which always worked, was to relentlessly berate her daughter and wish for her to cease being a hindrance to her endless fun. "Curse me for giving birth to this wretched thing," she used to shriek. "I wish she would disappear. Who needs her? She's nothing but a burden who's ruining my life." "What are you saying, you wicked woman?" the neighbour would cry out in horror. "To wish death upon an innocent soul! Come to your senses!" At this point, Carly's mother would always calm down, realising her manipulation had succeeded, and that she could now freely go on another spree. "What are you, Mrs. Ross? I'm just joking. I mean it metaphorically. You're so kind and helpful. You're always there to assist. I'm not going far, just out for a walk. Sometimes a woman needs a change of scenery. It's not always about home, work and worries." The cunning woman knew exactly what she was doing. A kind neighbour wouldn't abandon a little girl, so there was no rush to return home. They would manage without her. "I am kind, that's certain," Mrs. Ross responded. "But as for you, Lily, all you seem to do is seek a change of scenery. Your daughter is constantly alone. There's no food in the house. The refrigerator is off. The only food available is some dried-up Snickers bars, which are brought by your drinking buddies on your binge in exchange for your attention. But the mother was unstoppable. Hastily touching up her lips in front of a dull old mirror in the hallway, she used to throw back to the neighbour something like, "Stay out of my private life," and then disappeared in a direction she only knew, not even pausing to look at her daughter. Lily would usually show up on her doorstep a week or two later, staggering with the consequences of her reckless lifestyle, and collapse on the old couch, falling into a deep sleep. One day, Carly's mother was gone for a month. A concerned neighbour, fearing that she had died, took little Carly by the hand and reported the disappearance to the police. They found the mother shortly after. Somehow, she ended up in a hospital 500 kilometres away from her hometown, suffering from severe booze poisoning. The police, having uncovered the den, found Lily unconscious in the midst of a crowd of similar individuals. Not one of them had noticed her condition. Had a few more days passed, her bender could have resulted in an unnoticed death. The guardianship authorities have initiated the process of terminating Carly's mother's parental rights. Upon regaining consciousness in her hospital bed, she appeared relieved at the news and eagerly signed all necessary papers, looking forward to a free, unrestricted life beyond the hospital. Carly was relocated to an orphanage. Fortunately, the local orphanage was not a grim place. The staff consisted of compassionate women who treated the orphans as their own children. One of the educators, Mrs. Pollock, cheerfully remarked upon seeing Carly, "What a little flame we have here! I have never seen such bright red hair." The girl soon adapted to her new life. Mrs. Pollock did everything she could to help her integrate into their small group, make friends, and feel like a part of their close-knit circle. After leaving the hospital, Carly's mother never once remembered her daughter and never returned home. Eventually, Mrs. Ross received a summons from the police to identify a body which was found on a riverbank. Inside the pocket of a waterlogged, dirty cloak, the police discovered a water-damaged passport belonging to Carly's mother. Mrs. Ross, who came to the identification, crossed herself and looked at the deceased. She could definitely say the body in front of her on the morgue's table was Lily's. Soon she was buried, and from then on, the girl was considered a full orphan. Meanwhile, Carly proved to be a bright and capable child. Mrs. Pollock, a childless and unmarried woman, devoted her life to caring for orphans, and she invested a lot of time in the girl. By the time Carly was school-aged, she was already fluent in reading children's books, showed a keen interest in various subjects, and even dabbled in writing poetry. For her birthday, her teacher gifted her a beautiful glossy album for her poems, which she began filling with her own compositions. A voracious reader, Carly regularly visited the town library. She loved the tranquility and the smell of the books stored there, which led her to aspire to become a librarian. Mrs. Pollock encouraged Carly's love for books and reading at every opportunity. She even decided to create a makeshift library in the orphanage, appointing Carly as the responsible person. The girl was thrilled with the idea. She eagerly started her duties, which included maintaining the books, lending them out, and informing other children about new editions. The orphanage principal regularly purchased new books for the students. "If you want to become a real librarian, you need to be neat and responsible," Mrs. Pollock instructed Carly. "Remember, a librarian's job is to inspire an interest and love for reading." By the time Carly graduated from high school, she knew she wanted to pursue a literature-related degree. The town had a society for book lovers, literature and poetry, which Carly regularly attended. The society comprised amateur poets and writers, who often organised readings of their work. Carly actively participated in these events, and everyone agreed that her future should lay in literature and poetry. One evening, a new individual joined the regular members of the community. His name was Bernard Calhoun, and he was an elderly man around 70, with a respectful demeanour. He arrived at the community event in a gorgeous, old-style car, chauffeured by a driver, and had a habit of smoking a pipe filled with tobacco When Carly recited her poems, he clapped the loudest and predicted a successful literary future for her. In town, he was seen as a newcomer. Rumour had it that he had recently moved here from the capital, having bought a house, to exchange the incessant city noise for the tranquillity of a regional suburb. One evening, Mr. Calhoun invited the attendees to his mansion after the event to celebrate his birthday. While some were eager to return home and others had other commitments, a few, including Carly, were delighted to accept Mr. Calhoun's invitation. In the living room of his rather spacious house, there was already a table set with champagne. Carly, who was 17 at that moment, had never tasted alcohol, but when a thin glass filled with golden sparkling drink was placed in front of her, she found it inconvenient to refuse. The evening passed in a warm and sincere atmosphere. The host himself drank only mineral water, referring to the fact that doctors had categorically forbidden it. When Carly returned to the orphanage, Mrs. Pollack smelled a slight odour of champagne and became alarmed. When it turned out where the girl had been, she gave her a whole lecture about not trusting all men. Among them, there are vicious lovers of young girls, from whom one should stay as far away as possible. However, soon Mr. Calhoun himself paid a visit to the orphanage and asked permission from those responsible for the girl to let Carly help him sort out the extensive library in his house. "I heard that Carly aspires to have a career in librarianship," he told the director and the tutor, settling into a chair in the director's office. "And now I see where your student gets her love for books and reading," he remarked, observing the tall shelves lining the wall filled with books. The women remained cautiously silent. Mr. Calhoun's sudden interest in Carly aroused suspicion in them. Detecting this, the man chuckled and reassured them. "I understand your skepticism, but you have no cause for concern. I just wish to help a talented girl achieve her dream. She truly has a passion for librarianship. I've never seen a young girl so engrossed, not in fashion and cosmetics, but in books and reading. I have 2 grandchildren myself, but sadly, their interests are entirely different. As for Carly, it would be very useful for her to participate in such an endeavour. My library has amassed thousands of books over many years, some of which are quite rare and valuable." On hearing that the unexpected visitor had grandchildren of his own, the women relaxed slightly. However, the headmistress, casting a serious gaze at him, began to speak. "We certainly don't mind Carly participating in such activities, especially as she's preparing to enter the college next year. But rest assured, we will always keep an eye on her and protect her," the headmistress added sternly. "Well, I see the future is in safe hands," Mr. Calhoun joked in response. "You're absolutely right to take this matter seriously, so you don't have to worry in vain. I'll install a surveillance camera in my library, so you can see what Carly is doing in my house at any time. What do you think?" "Let's give it a try," the orphanage director agreed, looking relieved. When Carly heard about the upcoming opportunity, she was thrilled. Mr. Calhoun's house was filled with books, and the chance to go through them was a dream come true for her. Carly mainly helped Mr. Calhoun on weekends. She woke up early in the morning and rushed to his house to immerse herself in the vast world of books, of which his library had plenty. Mr. Calhoun typically awaited her with breakfast ready. Carly found it unusual to sit at a table with starched napkins and expensive dishes, while the housekeeper served her tea and hot pancakes with jam. However, Mr. Calhoun was an engaging and knowledgeable conversationalist, and Carly would quickly forget her surroundings, engrossed in another captivating discussion. Mrs. Pollack, on the other hand, monitored how Carly spent her time closely. "Carly, you are an adult now," she told the girl. "Soon you will start living independently. Of course, you can always rely on me, but decisions about your relationships, especially with men, will be yours alone to make." Always prioritize your own desires and interests. Never give in to pressure, especially when you're being forced to do something you don't want. Don't agree to such things, even if you're offered money for it. If you encounter such people, run away. Carly understood who Mrs. Pollock was warning her about, but Mr. Calhoun had never behaved in such a manner. On the contrary, he acted like a genuinely caring grandfather, as if he were Carly's own kin. The girl, who had never had a grandfather, or even a father, appreciated this approach. Mr. Calhoun liked to ask her opinion on various life situations. They even occasionally disagreed and argued over differing viewpoints. Mrs. Pollock was perplexed by the friendship between Carly and Mr. Calhoun, suspecting ulterior motives in their interactions. However, no matter how closely she observed, she found nothing suspicious. The day arrived when Carly, her long-time student with bright red curls, was to become completely independent of those who genuinely cared for her. As Mrs. Pollock stood in Carly's apartment, she realized that her pupil was not entirely ready for adult life. But what could she do? Carly couldn't stay in the orphanage, and it was time for her to mature. "Well, Carly, are you ready to run the household?" Mrs. Pollock asked cheerfully, surveying the apartment. "I've arranged for you a place of a saleswoman while you're preparing for the college." Picking up a large zippered bag from the floor, she placed it on a stool and opened it. "We collected some dishes and bedding for you. Use them and then buy whatever else you need." Mrs. Pollock chatted, her tone deliberately upbeat, but Carly could tell the woman was hiding her worry behind the chatter. "Mrs. Pollock, don't worry, I'm not going anywhere. We'll see each other every day just like before," the girl reassured her. "How can I not worry? For so many years you were so close, and now how will it all work out?" Mrs. Pollock mourned. "Well, you're right, there's nothing to worry about. I have to go, Carly. I have a lot to do today." The women hugged each other, then Carly shut the door behind Mrs. Pollock. A new life indeed, the girl thought, unpacking her belongings. Suddenly her phone started to ring. Mr. Calhoun had learned that it was Carly's birthday and insisted on giving her a personal gift, a new smartphone. "No refusals accepted," he said, noticing the girl's hesitation to accept the gift. "After all, I need to stay in touch with my assistant. What's so odd about that?" Carly answered the call, and it was Mr. Calhoun, requesting her to come over that day. She promised to arrive soon, right after unpacking and getting settled in her new place. About 3 hours later, Carly was stepping into the hallway of Mr. Calhoun's mansion. The master was sitting by the fireplace in the drawing room, engrossed in a book and puffing on a pipe of tobacco. "Well, how have you settled in?" he asked as Carly walked in. "Come in, sit down, and tell me, as well, where you decided to work before entering the college." Carly sighed and told the store where Mrs. Pollock had arranged a position for her. "Actually, I don't want to work there, but where else can I go?" she said. "You don't have to work at the store if you don't want to," Mr. Calhoun replied. "In fact, I have something to offer you. How would you feel about working for me? You do the same thing you're doing now, sorting my library, helping me catalogue, and occasionally keeping me company. We're friends, aren't we?" Carly smiled happily. She liked the sound of his offer. However, remembering Mrs. Pollock's cautionary words, she asked, "That would be great. Thank you for your care and consideration. But, Mr. Calhoun, why are you showing me such kindness? After all, you have your own grandchildren, and you probably have children too. You never talk about them." "Carly, girl," Mr. Calhoun began thoughtfully, seeming to decide something. "I've wanted to talk to you for a while, and now I believe the time has come. Look," he said, taking out a photograph and handing it to her. It was a picture of a young man with fiery red curly hair. Carly, puzzled, looked at the picture, clearly perplexed as to why Mr. Calhoun was showing it to her. Is this likely a relative of yours? Perhaps a son or grandson?
Well, not a grandson, Mr. Calhoun laughed in response. But you're right, he is my own son, he said, his tone suddenly serious. A son who unfortunately made many mistakes in his life and has now left this world. Alas.
What happened to him? The girl asked sympathetically.
The story is not a happy one, Mr. Calhoun replied. Perhaps I, as a father, didn't pay enough attention to my son. I left his upbringing to my wife and various nannies, the man said, shaking his head sorrowfully. I'm wealthy, very wealthy. I inherited a large, successful business from my father, which I have expanded throughout my life. However, I overlooked that there was no one to pass it on to. When I was younger, I foolishly believed that earning money and increasing wealth were the most important things. I missed out on a lot, not understanding the significance of a father's role in raising his child. My only son grew into a complete egotist, having been accustomed since childhood to the world revolving around him. His mother pampered him with luxury and attention, never demanding anything in return. As a result, he grew up believing that everyone owed him something, and he owed nothing to anyone. I should have noticed and made an impact, but I was always busy with business. And there's nothing I can do about it now. The path my son chose led him to ruin.
The old man sighed and fell silent. Carly listened patiently, sympathizing with him, but she didn't understand the purpose of the conversation. After a brief silence, Mr. Calhoun continued. From a young age, my only son, Richie, led a destructive and aimless life, with access to unlimited funds. He was introduced to alcohol, debauchery, and illegal substances early on. By 18, he was already an alcoholic, succumbing to every temptation and frequently losing control. When I finally realized the extent of his problems, it was too late. His mother, my wife, had been covering up his wrongdoings. I only learned about his lifestyle much later, and from strangers. Disagreements over our son led to frequent fights between my wife and me, ending in our divorce. She moved out afterward, demanding a separate residence for herself and her son, as well as substantial monthly support. This move effectively ended any influence I have over our Richie. After a while, I was informed by my ex-wife that Richie was getting married. Unfortunately, his chosen partner was nothing more than a gold digger. Richie's lifestyle remained unchanged after the wedding. I attempted to explain to him that he needed to alter his ways now that he was a husband and a family man. Much to my disappointment, my advice was met with laughter from him. "None of your business," Richie said to me disdainfully. This conversation took place in the morning, following a night of heavy drinking. Just a few hours earlier, my son had been barely able to stand, his breath reeking of alcohol. "Getting married wasn't my idea, it was Megan's. She wanted to get married, and I agreed just for kicks," he laughed, his voice thick with drunken glee. His young wife Megan was pregnant. It seemed that she did not care about her husband's lifestyle. Their marriage lasted a little over 3 years, during which Megan had another child. Decided that now she was quite well providing for herself at the expense of future alimony for 2 children, she calmly filed for divorce, and Richie didn't care about it. Following the divorce, I purchased a separate apartment for Richie's ex-wife and their 2 children. My son went on with his previous lifestyle, swiftly bringing home a new girlfriend who was as much of a drinker as he was. His apartment had turned into a haven for debauchery. I was constantly receiving complaints from neighbours and made numerous attempts to appeal to my son's conscience. Once, I was solemnly informed that Richie's new girlfriend was pregnant. Despite her condition, she sat next to him smoking a cigarette, laughing drunkenly and sipping potent alcohol. "Dad, you must join us.
in a toast to celebrate your soon-to-be grandson," insisted Richie, pouring a generous measure of brandy for me. But I realised one thing. If my son's girlfriend was really pregnant, then I had to save my future grandson. Under the pretext of getting acquainted with the future mother, I took her out into the corridor and drove her straight to the hospital. She snored in the back seat throughout the journey, seemingly unconcerned about her destination. Upon arrival at the hospital, she was brought to her senses and put to sleep. I spoke with the doctor beforehand and learned that she was really pregnant. The next day, I picked up the young woman from the hospital and brought her to my home, where she would be cared for by 2 nurses and a housekeeper. By the way, her name was Lily. When Lily realised her wild days were over, she made a fuss, refusing to live under supervision and demanding to be released immediately. However, I remained resolute. "Listen, Lily," I addressed her, "here's the plan. You will stay with me for a few months, everything provided, no alcohol or tobacco. If you behave, you'll live like royalty. After you give birth, you're free to leave, but the baby stays here. In exchange, I'll pay you a generous sum, and hopefully that will be the end of our dealings." The amount of money she would receive clearly captured her imagination. It seemed that she was mentally calculating how many bottles could be bought with this money. So she stayed in my house. Of course, I accepted the fact that she might not have been pregnant with my son. Given her lifestyle, she might not remember all her partners. Regardless, I resolved to protect this child, no matter who the father was.
"So, this girl has given you another grandchild?" Carly asked.
"No, unfortunately," replied the old man. "Lily managed to escape from my house shortly before her due date. She had tried repeatedly to persuade the staff to set her free, but to no avail. Then tragedy struck. My son was poisoned and died in the hospital. His ex-wife learned at his funeral that Lily had been living in my house and was soon to give birth to my grandchild. She realised this child would be the 3rd heir to my wealth, and she decided to eliminate the competition. I couldn't figure out why Megan suddenly started visiting my house under various pretenses and regularly brought over my grandchildren, who hadn't remembered me for months. I don't know how she did it, but one morning Lily's room was empty. Both nurses were asleep beside her. The housekeeper and I couldn't wake them. They were clearly drugged.
"But did you find Lily afterwards?" Carly asked hopefully.
"I didn't find her immediately," Mr. Calhoun sighed in response. "The girl had simply vanished. It was as if she never existed." I hired a detective to search for Lily nationwide. After all, it was uncertain whether Lily, considering her lifestyle, could survive on her own and give birth to a child. It wasn't until several years later that I found a lead in a small town. But by then it was too late. Lily was no longer alive.
"And the child? Was he or she found?" Carly asked Mr. Calhoun impatiently, who had become quiet and seemed lost in thought.
"We succeeded in our search, but also not immediately. Lily gave birth to a daughter." Mr. Calhoun smiled in reply. "In the town where Lily was buried, she was a stranger, leading a nomadic life. No one had ever seen a child with her, and no one could confirm whether she had a child or not. I had already assumed that Lily had never given birth or had given birth to a stillborn child, which wouldn't be surprising given her lifestyle. But it turned out that there had indeed been a baby."
Mr. Calhoun's voice quivered with excitement.
"Lily had given birth while living in another town. There, she was deprived of parental rights, and the child, a little daughter, was placed in an orphanage. I couldn't believe that the search had been successful, so I decided to see for myself. When I saw the girl, all my doubts about the paternity of my son disappeared instantly. The girl was an exact copy of Richie."
Mr. Calhoun fell silent, overcome with emotion. Carly waited patiently. Finally, the elderly man, having composed himself, continued.
I didn't reveal myself immediately. Instead, I observed the girl for over a year. The more I watched her, the more convinced I became. Thankfully, my granddaughter did not take after her father, but rather, it seemed, me. She was a talented, clever, good girl. She was so different from my other 2 grandchildren, raised by their mother, the gold-digger Megan, and my ex-wife. They valued nothing but money. They were petty, wicked, and incompetent. I always knew that if something happened to me, I wouldn't trust my business with them. But now, I am at peace.
Mr. Calhoun said with a contented smile.
Now I know who my successor can be, and I am so proud of her. Do you want to know who this girl is?
Mr. Calhoun asked slyly. Intrigued by his story, the girl eagerly nodded in response. With a solemn pause, the old man looked at her again and said,
It is you, Carly.
How can it be me? Carly, taken aback, continued to gaze at the elderly man in surprise. I don't understand anything, she muttered.
Carly, it's true, laughed Mr. Calhoun. You are my granddaughter. I realized it the minute I first saw you. Who else could have such fiery red hair? You're one of us.
I am the granddaughter you told me about, right? Exclaimed the girl in surprise. And you are my grandfather? The elderly man silently and excitedly nodded in response to Carly's realization. And you're right, my mum's name is Lily. I don't know my dad and grew up in an orphanage when my mum was deprived of parental rights. So it turns out that's right. The girl could hardly contain her joy. Mr. Calhoun, are you really my grandpa? Carly, casting aside any remaining doubts, lovingly embraced her grandfather. Mr. Calhoun also radiated happiness. But why did you only tell me about this now? She asked.
Well, there are reasons for that, the man replied seriously. When I found you and got to know you, I hadn't yet understood your way of life. I was afraid that such news might upset you, given your settled life, but I was certain you were my granddaughter. Hair colour is a family treasure. My other 2 grandchildren have inherited that hair colour too, and your dad, my son, was also a fiery redhead. However, we need to have a serious talk, my granddaughter. Mr. Calhoun suddenly shifted his tone. Unfortunately, I am very ill. Doctors predict only 2 or 3 more years for me, and that's if I lead a quiet, measured life free from worry and anxiety. There's no need to cry, he said, noting that the girl was quite upset by the news. You are the heiress of our family, and we have always been strong, self-confident people. Our son Richie might not be cut from the same cloth, but you are definitely one of us, Mr. Calhoun declared proudly. And I didn't start this discussion without reason. As I've mentioned, I want to ensure that I'm passing our family business into reliable hands. Now I see that those hands should be yours. Wait, don't argue, please, he continued, seeing that his granddaughter was about to say something. I realize you still have much to learn, and even if something happens to me, you should know that we have a few reliable and time-tested people in our business who will be your support at first. I'm confident you will handle everything, as you possess the most important trait, our family's character. And of course, I'm not planning to die just yet. On the contrary, I intend to live on.
Grandfather, I don't need anything from you, Carly exclaimed. The main thing is that I have you now. Won't your other grandchildren take offence and hate me if you give me your family business?
Carly, don't worry about such things, Grandfather replied. You are my successor now, and that's a great responsibility. As for your half-brother and sister, my other grandchildren, they will receive their share in my will. They're not interested in our business. They only care about the money. Sadly, their mother Megan, my son's ex-wife, and my ex-wife Bella instilled these values in them. I regret not intervening." The elderly man paused for a moment and then continued. "By the way, you'll soon meet them. After deciding to talk to you, I called them yesterday from the capital. They're on their way and should arrive soon."
"Mr. Calhoun, dinner is ready," announced the housekeeper as she entered the living room in a neat white apron. "May I serve?" she asked, pausing in the centre of the room. After receiving approval, she vanished, leaving behind the low, tinkling sounds of dishes from the dining room. Soon, the grandfather and granddaughter sat down for dinner. They discussed Carly's upcoming introduction to the other family members. When the housekeeper served tea, a bell rang in the hallway. The master instructed her to answer the door as he poured the fragrant hot tea into delicate porcelain cups. 2 visitors, a young man in his 20s and a woman around 25, both with fiery red hair, entered the dining room. The newcomers were visibly taken aback at the sight of Carly. They exchanged glances as the grandfather greeted them and introduced Carly as a new family member. The artificial kindness of their smiles failed to mask their unpleasant expressions when Carly shook hands with them. The brother was named Lucas and the sister Gia. Having recently eaten lunch on their journey, Lucas and Gia declined the meal but joined the grandfather and Carly for tea. They curiously asked the girl about her life. Upon discovering her talent for literature and poetry, they requested to hear her poems. Mr. Calhoun watched his grandchildren with a contented smile, not hiding his pleasure. As evening fell, and Carly prepared to leave to her apartment, Mr. Calhoun regretfully bid his granddaughter goodbye, securing a promise that she would return the next day. After Mr. Calhoun retired to his study to read and smoke a pipe before bed, the brother and sister sat on the couch by the fireplace and conversed in hushed tones. "Lucas, do you understand what's happening?" Gia whispered. "Remember, Mum told us about our father's girlfriend, so she did give birth to a child." Gia stated with disgust. "Have you noticed how excited Grandad is around her? He never acts like this with us. We might have to share our inheritance with her. I bet she'll try to take some of our money," she continued spitefully. Upon hearing the word money, Lucas jumped up. "Do you think he'll give everything to her?" he asked Gia doubtfully. "Who knows?" Gia replied. "But one thing is clear. We need to get rid of this orphan, no matter what it takes." The next day, everyone gathered once more in Mr. Calhoun's living room. After dinner, the grandfather thanked the housekeeper, who had started to clear the table. Turning to his 3 grandchildren, he said, "Good. You've all met. I'm delighted. From now on, Carly is as much a part of our family as you, Gia, and Lucas. To better acquaint yourselves, you should spend more time together. Go out, have fun, and Carly, I'll expect you tomorrow. We still need to sort out the library," said Mr. Calhoun, wrapping an arm around his granddaughter's shoulders. "Go enjoy yourselves. I have some business to attend to," he added before heading to his office. When he left, Gia turned to Carly, her tone deliberately cheerful. "So, any ideas? You know your town better than we do. Where should we go first?" Carly pondered for a moment before suggesting, "How about the local history museum?" Though she suggested it hesitantly, she was certain her brother and sister would hardly find a museum visit interesting. Lucas and Gia exchanged meaningful glances. The sister then discreetly nudged her brother and nodded towards Carly, saying, "What a wonderful idea, don't you think, Lucas? I find museums so fascinating." "Yes, it's a great idea," Lucas replied, feigning excitement.
We should definitely visit the local history museum. By the way, why don't you invite us to your home? Our grandfather encouraged us to get to know each other better, so we're interested in your life," he added, "and we'd like to visit you right away. Could you serve us tea, like a proper hostess?"
"Of course," Carly replied, beginning to think that her new relatives might not be as self-serving and as petty as her grandfather had suggested. They all got into Lucas's car and headed to Carly's place. Along the way, Carly, realizing she had nothing to offer them at her home, suggested they stop at a store. The siblings agreed enthusiastically. When Gia and Lucas loaded the food into the cart and approached the cash register, Carly expressed concern that she might not have enough money to cover the cost, and most of all, she was troubled by the expensive bottle of whiskey that Lucas had chosen, explaining that they needed to celebrate their reunion.
"Relax, Carly," he assured her. "We'll cover the cost. Your role is to keep us company and set the table like a true hostess."
Soon the siblings were at Carly's apartment, and Gia looked around with barely concealed contempt. "Very nice and cosy."
"Really, Lucas?"
she said, casting a glance at Carly, who was busy setting out the snacks they had bought at the store. Once everything was prepared, Lucas opened the bottle of whiskey.
"We should toast to our reunion," he said, pouring the drinks.
"I don't drink," Carly protested, watching as Lucas poured a generous amount of alcohol into her glass. "I've only tried champagne once in my life, and I didn't like it," she added doubtfully.
"Carly, are you kidding? You don't drink at all?"
"Never," Lucas said with conviction.
"Well, that's right, of course, but you have us now, your family, and such a behaviour is disrespectful, especially since we're your guests."
Lucas made a hurt face. "Carly, Lucas is right. You should show us respect. Maybe you don't know this, but there are certain rules for hosts' behaviour towards their guests. It's an excellent drink, and it's easy to drink. Have at least a few sips with us, out of respect." Lucas had already proposed the first toast to the meeting. Carly took a small sip and realized that the drink was indeed easy to swallow and had a mild taste. "Well, you see, and you didn't want to drink with us," exclaimed her half-brother, immediately refilling the glasses with a new serving of alcohol. "And now let's drink to the addition to our family. To you, Carly." He solemnly proposed a new toast, not giving the girl a second to think. Through a haze, the girl realized that the drink was much stronger than she first thought. Her head hummed, the room swayed like a boat trip on the water. Mrs. Pollack, the educator, arranged small river trips on an excursion boat for her students from time to time. For a moment, Carly felt like she was standing on the deck during one of these excursions. She took the glass filled by her brother with another serving of the intoxicating drink. "Drink!" she heard, the words echoing in her head like they were bouncing off the walls of a deep stone well. Carly, teetering on the brink of unconsciousness, felt an unwelcome liquid being poured down her throat. Unable to swallow, she coughed. "Quiet!" Gia hissed at her brother. "She could choke. God forbid. You'll answer to Grandpa for her. Remember, she left with us." "Calm down. Everything's under control," Lucas reassured in a muffled tone, keeping a close eye on Carly. "She seems ready." "Let's call Grandpa, Carly," he announced, and pulling out her phone, dialed Grandpa's number with a sly grin. "Now, sister, tell Grandpa how much you love him. Go on." He thrust the phone in front of Carly's face. The girl struggled to open her eyes and looked at the screen. Upon seeing her grandfather, she giggled and managed to slur. "Grandpa? Hi, it's me." "Carly, what's wrong? Are you sick?" Her grandfather's voice filled with alarm. "No, I'm very well. We've just had a bit to drink." Carly slurred, swayed, and collapsed on the floor, falling asleep instantly. Mr. Calhoun ended the call. The brother and sister looked at each other, laughed, and high-fived. Their plan had worked. Now,
Their grandfather would think twice about making any decision, having seen what his beloved new granddaughter was capable of. Meanwhile, Mr. Calhoun was truly upset and thought about what he had seen. Had he misjudged Carly, attributing to her qualities that his granddaughter did not possess? Was she going to follow in her parents' footsteps? I must go to her at once, he finally decided, pressing the bell to summon the houseworker. But suddenly, the elderly man felt a crushing pain in his sternum. He staggered, nearly losing consciousness. With a significant effort, he managed to stay upright. Soon his housekeeper arrived in response to his summons. "Hurry," he whispered with the last of his strength. "Tell the chauffeur to get the car. We need to leave immediately." Then he lost consciousness. Carly opened her eyes with difficulty, taking in her surroundings with surprise. She was lying on her couch at home. A table nearby held the remnants of appetizers, upturned glasses, and an empty bottle on its side. Attempting to get up, she felt a wave of dizziness. "What happened? What's wrong with me?" She tried to understand, but to no avail. Her memory returned abruptly, hitting her like a wave of ice. My brother and sister, they were here at my place. We were celebrating our reunions. With difficulty, Carly turned her head to look at the wall clock. It was 6 a.m. How long did I sleep? The girl wondered, realizing the feast must have lingered into the evening. She couldn't recall what had happened. A strange, unpleasant taste lingered in her mouth. Did I drink alcohol? She pondered, remembering her siblings had brought alcohol the previous day. Feeling unwell, Carly forced herself to get up, went to the kitchen and put the kettle on. The sight of the previous day's appetizers left on the plates induced waves of nausea. She had no appetite. After drinking tea, Carly cleared the table, set the alarm clock for 9 a.m. and went back to sleep on the sofa. Upon waking, she took a shower, but had no desire for breakfast. She began preparing for her visit to her grandfather's house. Usually, she would arrive there by 10 a.m. They would have breakfast, drink coffee, and then Carly would sort out her grandfather's library. Today, she knew she would arrive later than usual. Dialing his number, she planned to inform him that she will be late. However, there was no answer on her grandfather's phone. An hour later, she found the house empty too. "Where is the grandfather?" Carly asked the housekeeper, puzzled. "Don't you know?" the woman replied, surprised, as she cleaned the book racks. "Mr. Calhoun is in the hospital in serious condition. He's in intensive care. Miss Calhoun and her brother are with him at the hospital." Upon hearing this, Carly felt a chill. That's why her grandfather hadn't answered her call. She rushed to the hospital immediately. However, due to his serious condition, she was not allowed to visit him. Not knowing what else to do, she sat on a couch in the hallway. "There she is. Have you come to see the result of your inappropriate behaviour?" Suddenly, Carly heard someone's voice beside her. Looking up, Carly saw Gia and Lucas standing in front of her. "Yes, it's your fault that grandfather got sick," Gia exclaimed. "Why is it my fault? What happened?" Carly did not understand. "Look at this." Lucas, feigning indignation, pulled out his phone, turned it on, and shoved it in Carly's face. On the screen, Carly saw herself, barely coherent, and holding a glass at the table. "Do you like what you see?" Lucas asked mockingly. "There's more where that came from if you're not too ashamed to watch," he continued, scrolling through his phone. "Has Grandpa seen all this?" Carly was horrified. "Why did you show him all this? He shouldn't be worried at all," she said, shocked. "And now she blames us," Gia responded indignantly. "You were the one who video called him yesterday. He got sick when he saw the state you were in. You're just like your mother, an alcoholic and a total loser. Leave before we throw you out." We don't want to see you here again, Gia said angrily to Carly. Yes, her brother said snidely. It may happen to everyone, but if I were you, I wouldn't show my face here again. If you have even a shred of conscience left, you'd better leave nicely and forget you're our sister. Stunned by the news, Carly silently left the hospital lobby. She couldn't comprehend how she could have done such a thing. Maybe they are deceiving me, Carly thought, but how can I find out now? Even if they were lying about the video call, they have proof that I had been drinking alcohol that night. This means my granddad will see it anyway, and in his situation, it's unacceptable to worry now. The thought of never seeing her grandfather again filled Carly with dread. Uncertain of what to do next, she headed to the orphanage. Whenever she was in trouble or didn't understand a situation, she knew exactly whom to seek help from. The girl headed to Mrs. Pollock, but suddenly realized that she hadn't informed her teacher about her new-founded relatives yet. Events had unfolded so quickly that Carly hadn't had the chance to share this news with the woman who had become like family to her. Meanwhile, the teacher was, as always, at her workspace. She was delighted to see Carly, but quickly realized that the visit was not for casual conversation. Carly recounted the events of the past few days, leaving Mrs. Pollock surprised. Life is as unpredictable as any movie. No one saw this coming. I don't know what to do, Mrs. Pollock, Carly admitted after finishing her story. I'm afraid my grandfather will think poorly of me. As for this inheritance, I said at once that I didn't need anything, but my grandfather thinks that I am the right person to succeed him in the family business. My half-brother and sister don't seem thrilled about me being viewed as the heir to their grandfather's fortune. I suspect they may have set up the drinking incident to embarrass me in front of him. Carly, talk to them about it, Mrs. Pollock said heatedly. Promise them you'll renounce everything when it comes to the inheritance, and perhaps they'll leave you alone. However, I think if they are such petty people, it's better to have no relatives at all. I will try to talk to them, carefully replied doubtfully, but I'm not sure if they'll believe me. When grandfather spoke of them, he didn't have flattering things to say. He claimed they only cared about money, and they judge others by their own standards, so most likely they would want to get complete assurance that I won't claim anything. Then you should try explaining everything to your grandfather, Mrs. Pollock suggested. After all, he's still in charge, she added confidently. Carly nodded and, after saying goodbye, left Mrs. Pollock. She decided to speak to her relatives again and headed back to the hospital. Unfortunately, she was still not allowed to see her grandfather, and Gia and Lucas were nowhere to be found. She learned from the nurse at the reception that they had recently gone home. Determined to confront them, Carly set off for her grandfather's house. Gia and Lucas were having lunch in their grandfather's dining room. After the housekeeper cleared the soup dishes and brought out the main course, they began to eat and discuss the current situation. So, what now? Lucas asked, biting into a roasted turkey leg. So, our sis has been neutralized, and we can ease up. I doubt that, Gia replied, dabbing her lips with a starched napkin. We can't predict what grandfather will do when he recovers. Remember, as soon as he came to, he called for the notary at the hospital. She shook her head meaningfully. What that means we still don't know. Perhaps he decided to change something in our favour, Lucas suggested. Why? Are we already considered the main heirs? Gia objected. The most important thing is that our grandfather kept seeing her as the irresponsible daughter of his alcoholic mother. She succumbed to the allure of alcohol just like her mother. How can he trust her with the family business? But we weren't going to be trusted with the family business either, said the brother. Lucas, why do we even need it? Said his sister in response. We just want the inheritance. Then we can sell the business, split the money, and that's it. Their discussion was interrupted by an unexpected ring at the door. The housekeeper went to answer it, and Carly walked into the dining room a minute later. "Here she is, our cheerful sister," Lucas exclaimed upon seeing her. "I must speak to you," said Carly firmly. "Hear me out." "Go ahead, talk," said Gia, as the eldest, not even considering inviting her sister to sit. Carly stood before her relatives as if she were a guilty schoolgirl. Grandfather was right about them, she thought, and spoke up. "I want you to hear me now. I don't want your fortune. Understand? You probably arranged this drinking affair deliberately to present me negatively in front of our grandfather. Remember this, I never drank. I don't drink, and I will not start drinking, no matter who my mother is. So I don't want Grandpa to think poorly of me, and I'm going to explain the situation to him. You just stay out of my way." "Well, look at her," Gia responded in feigned surprise. "She's showing a character, acting like she's a worthy descendant of our family. Remember this, you're nobody," Gia said harshly. "You will not talk to my grandfather, understand? What's the guarantee you won't harm him and take his entire fortune? We don't want to be left with nothing." "He was right about you," Carly answered confidently. "You only value money in life. What if I give you my word that I'll renounce everything?" The brother and sister glanced at each other and burst into laughter. "Either you're mentally ill or too cunning," Gia scoffed. "Who in their right mind would voluntarily give up a huge fortune? Enough with your games," she concluded decisively. "You're going to leave here and never return. If you disobey, know that Grandfather will see other videos Lucas filmed during the feast. And as you said, we wouldn't let our grandfather worry," Gia added in a mocking tone. The phone rang in the hallway. The housekeeper answered it, and after a brief conversation hung up. Entering the dining room, she said, "The hospital called. Mr. Calhoun has passed away. His heart stopped and the doctor's efforts failed." "What news?" Lucas exclaimed in surprise. "Unexpected?" "Well, that's it," said Gia decisively, turning to Carly. "You can't speak to him any more, so there's no need for you to stay here. I hope you haven't changed your mind about the inheritance. Are you still refusing it, as you assured us earlier? Yes or no?" "I don't want anything from you," Carly cried out bitterly. "Poor grandfather, how could this happen? I just found out about you, and now I've lost you." She began to sob. "How touching. I'm going to cry too," Lucas remarked cynically. "Okay, if we've settled everything, then goodbye," said Gia, ignoring Carly's tears. "And by the way, don't you dare show up at the funeral. You have no place there. And my advice to you, forget this whole story soon," she added coldly. Overwhelmed with grief, Carly left her grandfather's house. She didn't know how to continue living, blaming herself for her grandfather's death. Her half-brother and sister's actions were cruel, and she was lost. Unable to cope with the grief herself, she called Mrs. Pollock and, sobbing, managed to tell her what had happened. "Oh, my poor girl, how many troubles have you had in such a short life? I'm very sorry to hear of your grandfather's death. Accept my condolences. But, you know, if I were you, I would still go to the funeral," Mrs. Pollack advised confidently. "You're as much as a grandchild as your brother and sister, even if you decided to renounce your inheritance. You have the right to say goodbye to your grandfather. At the hospital, you were kept away from him by your half-sibling's wishes. However, I still don't understand why you chose not to accept the inheritance." "It was wrong of you to go along with their demands," the educator added. Carly didn't answer. She just thanked her teacher for her advice and support and hung up the phone. When she got to her apartment, she immediately went to bed and fell into a deep sleep.
Carly's grandfather's funeral was in 3 days. After some consideration, Carly agreed with Mrs. Pollack's point of view. No one had the authority to prevent her from bidding farewell to her grandfather. She called her grandfather's residence and asked the housekeeper to share the time and location of the funeral. Despite the young owners having forbidden the staff from allowing Carly into the house or even communicating with her, the housekeeper secretly informed Carly about the funeral arrangements. The woman was not fond of the young masters. They had started behaving disrespectfully and rudely towards her, even before they had fully assumed their roles as heirs. Neither Mr. Calhoun nor Carly had ever allowed themselves such behaviour. Sincerely thanking the housekeeper, the girl resolved to attend the funeral. At the designated time, she arrived at the funeral home, striving to attract minimal attention and to avoid being seen by Gia and Lucas. The ceremony was already in progress. During the service, Carly stood at the back, attempting to glimpse her grandfather in the coffin over the heads of the mourners. She spotted Gia and Lucas immediately in the front row. The room was filled with other people, relatives, friends and associates of Mr. Calhoun. Gia periodically turned around to whisper with 2 women shrouded in black. Those must be her mother and grandmother, grandfather's ex-wife, Carly thought. Finally, the ceremony concluded, and it was time for the farewell. Gia and Lucas, showing profound grief, were the first to approach the coffin, followed by the other attendees. After the siblings left the room, Carly looked around, then cautiously approached the coffin. As she looked at her grandfather, she couldn't hold back her tears. Suddenly, Carly noticed a suspicious stare directed at her. An elderly lady in a mourning hat with a veil, who had been standing next to Gia and Lucas during the ceremony, was eyeing her warily. Eventually, the woman approached Carly and said angrily, "Aren't you the alleged granddaughter of my ex-husband, who has just appeared from nowhere? Do you think being a redhead makes you the heir? Perhaps you've dyed your hair," she shouted angrily. "What's the matter, Grandma?" Gia and Lucas appeared nearby. "Look, a snake has shown up after all," hissed the half-sister, noticing Carly. "Get out! Lucas, help me!" The relatives grabbed Carly under her arms and forcefully dragged her towards the exit. Once outside, the relatives tossed Carly onto the ground. "That's it," Gia bent down and sternly said to Carly's face. "It seems you don't understand words, so know this. The inheritance is ours, always has been and will continue to be. And you, as you've always been a nobody, will remain so. If I ever see you again, it will be your own fault. You'll regret it, I promise. We won't hesitate to do anything, you know?" Relatives seated in the hearse, the coffin containing my grandfather's body, was sealed and placed in the back. The hearse then proceeded to the cemetery. Carly, struggling, rose to her feet and set off for home. Her relatives' worry was misplaced. She had no intention of claiming the inheritance and wasn't interested in the details of her grandfather's will. The following day went by in a haze. Carly called grandfather's housekeeper to inquire about his burial location. However, the woman insisted she refrain from visiting the cemetery yet, as the new owners had strictly forbidden her from revealing the burial site. The will would be read the next day. Once all the relatives returned to the capital, leaving the housekeeper in charge, she and Carly could visit Mr. Calhoun's grave. Grateful, Carly ended the call with the housekeeper. She had to settle her life, so pulling herself together, she got a job at the store that Mrs. Pollack had mentioned. However, when the next day the will was read out by the notary, the relatives were stunned. What they heard upon after the opening of the sealed envelope left them bewildered and incensed. "This is outrageous! It can't be!" the relatives all shouted simultaneously.
Overwhelmed by what she had heard, Mr. Calhoun's ex-wife collapsed onto the floor. "Ladies and gentlemen, please, quiet down," interjected the notary. "Everything is legal. I have substantial proof that the late Mr. Calhoun instructed me about his will in the presence of witnesses, while he was of sound mind. Besides all the documents, I also have a video of the process filmed by a specially appointed person. Plus, I must warn you that the will cannot be contested. Mr. Calhoun also left a separate letter for the heiress. And speaking of which, where is she?" The notary glanced around the room, scrutinizing the relatives seated at the table. Meanwhile, Carly was tidying up her apartment, as she was starting her new job at the store the next day. Expecting to be busy for the next few days, Carly decided to clean in advance. Suddenly, the doorbell rang. Dropping her wet rag on the floor, Carly went to answer the door. Standing in the doorway was a young man in a business suit. "Hello," he said to the girl. "I am an assistant notary entrusted by your grandfather, Mr. Calhoun, to handle his will. You are urgently needed at the reading. I've been instructed to bring you to the notary's office immediately. Please set aside your tasks for a while and come with me. Everyone is waiting." Carly's arrival caused a noticeable murmur of indignation among the relatives. The notary asked for silence. Once quiet, he said, "Mr. Calhoun has instructed me to read out a letter addressed to the heiress Carly in the presence of all relatives. This letter exists in written form and as a video recording where the deceased himself reads the text. Please familiarize yourself. My dear granddaughter Carly, I anticipate that this news may not bring you joy, and there are reasons for that. However, I have given it thorough thought before making this decision for the event of my death. Please know, I never doubted you for a second. I have always been convinced that you are the most deserving heir to my fortune. Consequently, I bequeath all my property, along with our family business, solely to you. I implore you not to reject this gift and not to succumb to the provocations of your new relatives. You are the only hope for our family business. I am aware that my time is limited, so I ask you earnestly to fulfill my last will. Do not doubt your abilities, and do not fear the challenges of managing such a significant and new responsibility. In the near future, my trusted associates and friends will reach out to you. They will provide you with guidance, collaborate with you closely, and lead our business while you continue your studies at the university. As for your siblings, Gia and Lucas, I have a task for you as well. Encourage them to join any of our businesses of their choice. It will be beneficial for them to start earning their own living. If they decline, do not force them. However, in such a case, Gia and Lucas will have to seek their means of survival. After you inherit, the only beneficiary will be my ex-wife Bella, due to her old age. Your half-brother and sister will no longer receive financial support. Fear nothing, my dear. I am confident that you can overcome any obstacle, no matter how daunting it may seem. I believe in you unconditionally. Your loving grandfather. The notary finished reading. A silence fell over the room. Everyone waited for the heiress's response. Carly cried inconsolably, unable to speak a word. Well, the will has been announced. The notary concluded. The heiress, Carly O'Donnell, will assume the rights of succession in accordance with the law. Now, I would ask everyone to sign.
Ted never stopped admiring Shelley. "What a beauty you are," he would say with such adoration that it made her uncomfortable. "All men envy me for having such a smart and beautiful woman." Shelley frowned, slowly shifting her gaze to her husband, who sat in a chair with his foot on her leg, admiring her. "Are you saying that if I was less beautiful, you would pay no attention to me, and could even cheat on me?" she asked. Compliments were nice, but not when they only focused on her looks. Shelley disliked people who judged others solely based on their appearance. People aren't always blessed with exceptional looks, like Ted. He was an ordinary guy, but he had that special something. Although Shelley's mother often advised her daughter to take off the rose-coloured glasses and look at him from a different angle, Ted didn't earn much, gave her flowers infrequently, and lived with his mother. After their wedding, his plan was to move into Shelley's apartment. In addition, even now Shelley had to pay for most of their joint vacations with mutual friends. The young woman hoped things would change after the wedding. Ted was currently taking courses and was soon going to switch from a part-time job to a permanent one. "Well, honey, don't misinterpret my words. It's a compliment," he said. Shelley smiled, but she still felt a lingering discomfort. Beauty is fleeting, present today and perhaps gone tomorrow. No one knows what the future holds. Shelley's mood darkened, and she no longer wanted to attend Ted's best friend's birthday party. "Why are you so glum? It's a celebration. We should be happy on such a splendid day," Ted chuckled, hugging Shelley. "Are you upset? Should I stop praising your slim waist and beautiful face?" "Ted, do you love me or just my appearance?" Shelley asked seriously. "Your beauty is a part of you. You're overreacting. It's difficult to please women. They get upset if you don't compliment them, and then they sulk when you do. I can't win," Ted said, breaking the hug and heading towards the door, leaving Shelley alone. Regaining her composure, Shelley slid her feet into her new sandals, buckled the straps and followed Ted. Maybe he was right, and she had overreacted. "Ted, did you buy a present for Ben?" she asked once they were in the car. Ted's mother gave him a car, often emphasizing her ability to afford such an expensive gift for her son. She often implied that Shelley should be grateful to use her car. "I didn't buy anything, but as they say, the best gift for him is us," Ted said. Shelley was a little bit ashamed. She was not accustomed to showing up at someone's house, especially for a birthday, without a gift. "Ted, that's rude. You know I can't do that," Shelley responded indignantly. "Oh, don't start again. You know I'm having financial issues right now, and Ben knows that my studies don't allow me any time to work. Stop complaining. Let's just go and sincerely congratulate him. That's it." "No, let's stop and buy him something. I have some savings," Shelley insisted. "Well, if you say so," Ted smiled, seemingly expecting such a response. They visited the mall and purchased a wristwatch. Although it cost slightly more than Shelley had budgeted for the gift, Ted insisted on it, arguing that Ben would discard a cheaper watch. "Why did you park the car here, Ted? You said we'd just stop by, congratulate Ben, have a short stay and then head home," Shelley asked as they parked a block away from Ben's house, near a posh high-rise. "Well, he lives in a risky neighbourhood, while this place is full of surveillance cameras everywhere. Plus, a walk is good exercise. We need to stay fit," Ted replied. After 10 minutes of walking, the couple noticed a massive cloud of smoke and a burning odour that provoked concern. Ted noticed the fire and attempted to lighten the mood by joking that he hoped his friends weren't so intoxicated that they set the house on fire with fireworks. Shelley shuddered at such a statement. As Shelley approached the crowd, she saw a small house going up in flames. One room was already engulfed in bright flames, while another was on the verge. And then, through the hum of the people gathered around and the crackling of the fire, Shelley heard the child's cry, and her heart squeezed.
Perhaps it was a play of the imagination, but that cry was like an impulse to rush there and help. "Shelley, why are you just standing there? We're late. We're going to miss out on the fun, and Ben will be upset that his best friend didn't show up." Ted tugged on her arm, but Shelley only had eyes for the window. "There's a child there, Ted. We have to help him," she said, scanning the crowd. Many were filming the scene on their cell phones, seemingly oblivious to the child's cry. "What child?" Ted scoffed. Shelley looked at her fiancé, then back at the window. Her eyes and ears weren't deceiving her. Now there really was a child's figure there. Without a second thought, she pulled her arm free and rushed towards the burning house, intent on saving the child. Flames were already licking at the door. There was no other way in. If she didn't act now, the child would die. From a distance she heard Ted shouting at her, calling her a fool and saying he wouldn't wait for her. Shelley opened the front door, which fortunately was not locked. She shrieked as the voracious flames surged towards her, a burning beam collapsing from the ceiling just a meter away. By the time she reached the room, it felt as if her skin was on fire. The intense heat was unbearable, yet at that moment she was not thinking about herself. A frightened little boy was huddled in the corner. She beckoned him, but he was too scared to move. Locking the door to his room to prevent the flames from entering, Shelley surveyed the smoke-filled space. The windows were old and wooden. She didn't know how long it would take to open them and get out. "Trust me, okay? I'll help you. I'm a good fairy who will save you. Just don't run away, and don't be afraid of me, okay?" The boy looked surprised and nodded. His long-sleeved sweater was slightly burned, and his pants had holes in them. Seeing this, Shelley felt a painful twinge in her heart. The boy approached Shelley and clung to her leg as she struggled to open the windows. The old latches were stubborn, and the alarming crackle of the approaching fire made her throat tighten. Finally, she managed to open the windows, climbed onto the sill, and swiftly lifted the boy into her arms. She felt a painful sting on her chest and looked down to see her dress clinging to her, scorched by the flames. Overwhelmed by adrenaline, she hadn't noticed that she had been burned. She knew she would have to treat the burn for a while, but the most important thing was that she had managed to save the boy's life. She lowered the boy to the ground and got out the house herself. The smell of burning sent waves of nausea through her. Exiting the gate, she gazed at the onlookers, realizing that Ted wasn't among them. He had chosen a friend's birthday over the safety of his fiancée. The wailing sirens of the fire truck and an ambulance shattered the air. The entire house was consumed by fire. Weak from smoke inhalation and burns, Shelley barely managed to stay on her feet. A stern voice asked, "Is anybody still at home?" Startled, Shelley shrugged and responded, "I don't know, I'm a passerby. I rescued the boy I saw in the window." The child pointed at the house and said, "Mum." Shelley held him tighter, whispering reassurances, although she knew his mother likely didn't survive. As a paramedic approached, Shelley handed him the child, then nearly fainted. Another paramedic led her to the ambulance, muttering about her young age and severe burns. "Can I have a drink, please?" she managed to mumble, before losing consciousness. Shelley woke up in the hospital, her head throbbing and her body aching. She didn't know how long she had been there. When she saw her bandaged hands and realized her face, chest, and legs were similarly bound, she was horrified. She remembered the flames licking at her as she made her way to the boy's room, but she hadn't thought her burns were so severe. Tears welled in her eyes. A nurse entered the room and, seeing Shelley conscious, approached with a look of sympathy. "Why are you crying? You're our heroine," the older woman warmly smiled. "A heroine? I just did what any human being should do," Shelley replied. "Exactly. Should. But not everyone would. Gretchen, the paramedic who brought you in, told me that the men just stood by and watched.
You heroically saved the boy. Without you, he wouldn't have survived. Your story has been in the news for the past 5 days. There's a swarm of reporters around the hospital wanting to interview you. 5 days? I thought it was only 2 days. Have I been unconscious for that long? Don't be surprised. You inhaled a lot of smoke and were unconscious for a while. Then the doctors decided to keep you sedated to let your body recover without the stress of crying or hysterics. They performed a skin graft on your face. Tears trickled down her cheeks, soaking into the gauze wrapped around her face. Shelley remembered Ted's words from their last conversation about his fixation on her looks. He probably wouldn't comment on her beauty anymore, she thought. Has anyone visited me? The woman inquired, hopefully. Your mum came by. She's distressed about you. She just left the hospital. Before that, she was by your side. She had to leave, but promised to return soon, the nurse replied. Shelley let out a sigh, trying to dispel her sadness. Could Ted really be so upset that he hadn't even attempted to contact her these past 5 days? Where's my phone? I need to phone my fiancé that I'm okay. Your mum took care of your personal belongings. You can ask her about them when she arrives. Now, I need to check on other patients. Rest up. The doctor will be visiting tonight. As the nurse was about to leave, Shelley stopped her. Wait, what about the boy? Do you know what caused the fire and if his mother survived? The boy is alive thanks to you. His mother unfortunately did not fare as well. She fell asleep with a lit cigarette, which caused the fire. Luckily, the boy had the sense to lock himself in his room. After the nurse left, Shelley was left alone with her thoughts. While various ideas swirled in her mind, one kept her particularly uneasy. Did Ted call, or did he no longer need her? Shelley's mother arrived at the hospital soon and brought her things. In tears, she wailed, You were brave but reckless. I was terrified when I got the call. Thank God everything worked out and you're alive. Do you understand how it could have ended? It could have ended with the death of a child, so I don't really regret anything, Mum. I'm sorry. I had to upset you. Is Dad with Molly? Yes, I had to take your little sister to her father. I wasn't thrilled about the idea, but you need me more than she does right now. Mum, you should go home. I can manage. I have Ted. Tell me where the phone is. I'll call him and inform him about my situation. I'm sure he'll come immediately to support me. He must be worried. Mum looked at Shelley with pity and chewed her lips in silence. Shelley could see that she wanted to say something, but was hesitant. This made her feel uncomfortable, as the most dreadful thoughts were swirling around in her mind. What's wrong, Mum? What do you know? Please don't be silent. Tell me the truth. Did something happen to Ted? You no longer have Ted. The doctors called him first, informed him about your situation, and then... Mum paused, as if gathering her thoughts. He called and told me that he couldn't be with you, that he didn't need you like this, that he was withdrawing the application from the registry office. Shelley, don't worry. Everything will be fine. We're with you. If you like, Molly and I will move in with you, or you can move in with us. We won't abandon you in times of trouble. Is it that bad? Shelley asked fearfully, looking in the mirror hanging on the wall above the sink. Instead of a beautiful girl, Shelley saw a real mummy. It was terrifying to even imagine what was under the bandages. You've had surgery. Your father paid for the best possible treatment, but the doctor said you would need plastic surgery to avoid a scar. You can do that later if you wish. They did everything they could. Each word was delivered with difficulty by her mother, and Shelley struggled to believe her. Shelley shook her head, fighting back tears. The pain of accepting such a truth was immense. Some of the tears must have seeped into her bandages, causing a stinging sensation. She gritted her teeth against the pain. Mum, where's my phone? I need to speak to Ted.
I need to hear from him directly that he doesn't want me anymore. Please, give me my phone." If she heard it from him, she would accept that it was over, that he had left and no longer needed her. Until then, it all seemed like a terrible dream, a nightmare from which she couldn't awaken. Her mother stood up, walked over to the nightstand, took out her phone and handed it to her. "But if I were you, I wouldn't beg, sweetheart. Why do you need him? Why do you want to humiliate yourself for such a man?" Shelley looked through the missing calls, and they were all from work. Ted hadn't called. Her friends had vanished as well. Shelley saw an opened message from Ted, most likely read by her mother. "I've removed the application from the registry office. Recover, and then we'll see if I need a wife like you." Shelley felt a piercing pain in her heart. She hadn't believed he could betray her like this. Although she had her suspicions, she had tried to believe in the best. Now, the best was nothing more than a bitter memory. Glancing at the engaging ring on the nightstand, she realized she would never wear it again. Why should she, when there was no wedding and the groom had fled at the first sign of trouble? "Mum, I can handle this," she insisted. "Go to Molly. She's not used to her father. It's hard for her. I'll take care of everything. If I need anything, I'll ask Michelle to bring it to the hospital." Sarah lowered her head, understanding that Shelley was right. Molly had been born to her at her late age. Shelley was already in her 20s, and Sarah was in her 40s. Her marriage to Shelley's father was crumbling. Perhaps she was trying to keep him by having another child, or just wanted to find some joy in the little one, because she felt that soon Shelley would fly out of the family nest, and her husband would leave as well. And he did leave when Sarah was 7 months pregnant. In all her 7 years, Molly has seen him only on holidays, mistaking him for a distant uncle. "Are you sure you can handle this?" Sarah asked, her voice heavy with concern. "Of course, Mum," Shelley replied. "Thank you for your support. I won't shed tears for a man who doesn't deserve them. You were right. Ted isn't worth it." Sarah cried and hugged Shelley, who struggled to contain her emotions. Shelley didn't want anyone to feel sorry for her or to view her as an invalid. Despite the terrible incident, she had survived, just like the innocent boy who had almost died in a fire because of his mother. Taking Shelley's promise to keep in touch and report everything that happens, her mother said she would buy tickets for the next plane and return home to Molly. When she left the room, Shelley let all her emotions out and sobbed bitterly. Probably loving heart still could not accept the fact that Ted did such a despicable thing to her, since he had sworn that he would love Shelley to the grave. But instead, he gave up easily and quickly when she needed him. The tears quickly turned into a real hysteria, so the doctors again sedated Shelley to sleep more and recover faster. The next morning, Michelle visited Shelley with gifts and words of encouragement. She praised Shelley's bravery, admitting that she would have been too scared to act as Shelley had. "Well, you've always been reckless, so what's surprising?" chuckled Michelle. "Don't worry, it'll heal before the wedding. It's in December, isn't it?" Her friend's words stung Shelley. "There won't be a wedding, Michelle. But you're right, everything will heal in time." Shelley knew better than anyone that scars do not heal. They linger for life. The most painful ones are the heart wounds inflicted by those closest to you. "Wait, there's no wedding? Why? When did you and Ted break up? And why didn't you tell me?" Michelle was shocked. "He left me over the phone when he found out I was burned saving a boy." "What a jerk!" Michelle exclaimed. "He thinks I'm a freak," Shelley said, fighting back tears. 3 weeks later, Shelley was discharged from the hospital. She had minor marks on her hands and some ugly patches of skin on her face, but otherwise she was healing nicely. Michelle met Shelley at the hospital with a bunch of balloons, which they released into the sky. Shelley was given a week off from work and promised a work-from-home arrangement
until the new year, giving her time to recover. When Shelley and Michelle arrived at the apartment building, Shelley saw Ted at the entrance. He was standing at the entrance, holding a bouquet of flowers and waiting for someone. Shelley's heart skipped a beat, thinking he had come to his senses to apologize. Except that, when she and Michelle approached, he wrinkled his nose in disgust. "Ted, why didn't you let us know you were coming?" Shelley asked. "You should have sent a message or called."
"Oh, Shelley, I haven't come to you," Ted remarked, chuckling.
Another painful remark lodged itself into her memory. Shelley nodded and tried to leave, but her ex-fiancé seemed intent on causing a scene.
"So you thought I bought such a beautiful bouquet for such a freak?" Ted asked, scrunching his face in distaste.
"Mind your language before you lose your tongue," Michelle retorted. "You're no better than a monkey yourself, yet you act as if you're Apollo descending among us mortals." Michelle put her arm around Shelley, who reached into her pocket for the apartment keys.
"Let me be a monkey, but not so ugly. You've hit the jackpot, Shelley. Now I'll never tell you how beautiful you are again, and no one will."
Shelley turned away and sobbed with resentment, but she didn't respond to him. Meanwhile, Michelle was already going to say something in response to such cruel words when the entrance door opened and Shelley's neighbour Paula, who lived 2 floors below, stepped out. She often asked Ted and Shelley for lifts, and now Shelley realised it wasn't just for convenience. They probably had a thing even when she and Ted were engaged. Frozen in shock, Shelley watched as Paula hung around her ex-fiancé's neck, kissed him, and accepted the bouquet with delight. Ted held Paula close and led her to his car, whispering that Shelley was so ugly. The girl giggled nastily, glancing her way as if to show Shelley she had won a game. "Shelley, let's go to the apartment already. Stop humiliating yourself in front of them. He's not worthy of you," Michelle insisted, and Shelley nodded. She was right. He wasn't worthy. "You just have to move on. Everything will pass. All wounds will heal. We'll see how he feels when it's too late." Shelley knew her friend was right, but she couldn't bear to see her reflection. Disgusted by her own appearance, she chose to avoid mirrors, as her skin was still healing. She felt a deep self-loathing and didn't want to face herself. When Michelle left, Shelley covered all the mirrors in her apartment, deciding that she would eventually accept herself, but not any time soon. Left alone in her apartment, Shelley succumbed to tears, reminiscing about the last time she was with Ted, who was now with another woman. When Shelley finally calmed down, she thought of the boy she had saved. She wondered about his well-being and felt a connection to him, as if they were 2 halves of a broken soul. The next day, Shelley found out which orphanage he was in and decided to visit him. The teacher who greeted Shelley was kind-hearted and praised her for her actions. Yet Shelley felt uncomfortable with such admiration, questioning why acts of kindness were perceived as heroic. The teacher described Kyle, the boy Shelley saved, as a quiet, intimidated child who often cried and appeared to be waiting for someone. She led Shelley down a narrow corridor towards the meeting room. "Does he have no family? Was his mother his only close relative?" she asked. "Not exactly. Kyle has a father, but the situation is complex. His mother was officially a single. It appears the guardianship authorities found Kyle's father, who regularly sent money for the child, but they can't get in touch with him. Neighbours say he visited once a year, but the mother consistently rejected him. She accepted his money, but denied him entry. We don't know if he'll return. He might have started a new family, thinking he's unwanted and unnecessary here. Kyle can't be adopted yet, but we can formalise guardianship until we find his father. Kyle needs a family, but who would take in such a troubled and traumatised child? It will take time for Kyle to adjust to a new environment." Shelley didn't understand why the woman was telling all this to her. She had just come to see the child and meet him. She hadn't intended to look after him, let alone adopt him. Meanwhile, Shelley felt anger towards Kyle's father, seeing him as irresponsible. He had only provided financial support while his son lived with a careless mother. He didn't try to save his child, even though he knew about the mother's character. Perhaps all men are like this, Shelley thought, reflecting on her own experiences. She didn't want any new relationships now. What was the purpose? In her eyes, men weren't reliable. Her own father had left their family. Her ex-partner, Ted, abandoned her when she lost her youthful looks. Now, Kyle's father had left his son with an unreliable woman and was absent when his child needed him most. Probably there are no more strong, devoted men who are ready to be near their women and children, no matter the situation. Shelley sighed heavily, burdened by the weight of her thoughts. The trials of life seemed overwhelming, and while lost in contemplation, she found herself in the meeting room. The teacher had promised to bring Kyle soon. She sat on the soft sofa, observing the toys and drawing table. This was where prospective parents met the children, studying their behaviour to select the child most compatible with their character. It was as if they were picking pets to adapt to their lifestyle. But this thinking felt flawed to Shelley. If your heart is drawn to a child, you should be the one to adjust, to adapt, and to grow accustomed to a shared life, rather than forcing the child to conform to your habits. Soon the teacher returned, hand in hand with a boy in pyjamas, a scar similar to Shelley's adorning his cheek. They shared this unique feature, a fact that made Shelley smile sadly. It was like a birthmark. "Hi, Kyle," she greeted, and the boy regarded Shelley in surprise for a moment. He clung to the teacher's hand, but upon recognizing who was standing in front of him, he rushed towards Shelley, shouting, "Fairy!" "Yes, it's me, your fairy," the woman smiled, instantly understanding what he was referring to. The boy clung to Shelley, sobbing. The teacher excused herself, stating she would return in about 10 minutes to see how things were progressing. The boy remained mostly silent. He spent the entire 10 minutes in Shelley's arms. Then he jumped off, ran to the table, and started drawing. Shelley watched him, her heart aching at the thought of human cruelty. She couldn't understand why his mother hadn't possessed the feelings commonly referred to as maternal. Why hadn't she paused to appreciate her little ray of sunshine? Why was alcohol more valuable to her than her own child? "Fairy!" The boy ran up to Shelley, showing his drawing. His innocent sincerity and straightforwardness brought tears to her eyes. He had drawn a small figure with wings. Shelley accepted the drawing, patting the little boy on the head. The teacher peeked into the room, gestured that she was in the next room, and indicated that Shelley could call her at any minute. But Shelley didn't want to leave the boy. She felt a strong connection to him, even if she couldn't understand why. They had both been abandoned by their loved ones due to shared misfortune. Shelley moved to the mat and played with Kyle using some toys. The boy was clever. If his parents had nurtured him, he might be more developed now. His speech was poor for his age, and Shelley wanted to help him, to teach him, but she was uncertain if she could. "Hurt!" The boy pointed to the burn on Shelley's face, and the woman nodded. "Yes, you and I have similar wounds," she replied with a smile. The boy climbed back into Shelley's lap and hugged her. They sat like that for a while, until the teacher returned and announced it was time for lunch and then nap. Shelley nodded and looked into the frightened eyes of Kyle. The boy understood that it was time for him to leave, and they were being separated. "Don't worry, I will definitely come to see you again." "Tomorrow?" asked Kyle, and Shelley smiled. "I don't know," she answered honestly. "I have to work tomorrow, but we will definitely meet again, I promise you." Kyle pouted, lowered his head, and went to the teacher. He turned around several times, looking hopefully in Shelley's direction. When he was taken away, the woman cried in despair. She knew she couldn't get too attached to him because he had a father. Although the man wasn't as reliable as one would hope a father to be, he still had more rights. The boy's relatives on his father's side could potentially take him away. Perhaps Shelley shouldn't have visited, as her heart was now tied to the boy, and she wanted to help him by becoming a family for him, but she realized that this was impossible. Shelley clutched the child's drawing and left, agonizing over what to do next. Stepping outside, she breathed in the aroma of the autumn air, filled with a mysterious magic, and involuntarily smiled. Could it be that fate had brought her together with this child? Her bosses at work were understanding, allowing her to do all her reporting from home. Shelley had taken work home before, as it was more convenient. She could get more paperwork done in a few hours at home than she could in an entire day at the office. Her boss gently suggested that she might return when she would feel more comfortable. Shelley wanted to tell him that her appearance didn't bother her in the least, but that would be a lie. After enduring insults from her ex, Shelley became withdrawn. She started wearing caps and big sunglasses, lowering her head in public to hide her scarred face. While plastic surgery could have easily taken care of the scar, Shelley wanted to accept her new self. However, finding the strength to do so was difficult, so now she was just trying to navigate life without her fiancé, while caring for a little boy who desperately needed her. Shelley began visiting Kyle almost daily. She enjoyed spending time with the boy, even though she knew they were growing attached, without knowing if they would ever become a family. Several months went by without any sign of the boy's father. This didn't mean Shelley could rest easy, thinking he would never return to claim his son. She couldn't shake off the fear that he might find them and try to take Kyle away from her. After much consideration, she decided to take custody of the boy. This required gathering numerous documents, but the head of the orphanage reassured her that her chances of approval were high. Whether they interacted at home or in the orphanage, Shelley felt no difference. However, she noticed the other children's aggression negatively affecting the boy, who had already endured a hard life. They ridiculed him for the scar on his face, calling him ugly. After hearing this from the teacher, Shelley was determined to take Kyle out of there as soon as possible. She began to assemble the necessary paperwork, hoping the approval wouldn't take long. "Oh, Shelley, why are you so focused on this boy?" Michelle lamented. "You don't even know who his family is. What if his father shows up? What will you do then?" "Firstly, his father hasn't come forward yet. I'm confident the police have contacted him about his ex-girlfriend's death. Secondly, I feel a strong connection with this boy. It's as if he's my own." Shelley tried to explain her bond with the boy to Michelle. Unfortunately, Michelle couldn't understand, as she had never experienced such a connection. Communicating with someone who speaks a different language can be challenging. Michelle was not a mother yet. She didn't even have siblings, so she couldn't understand Shelley. Meanwhile, Shelley's mother supported her wish to adopt the boy. Only she worried about the difficulties her daughter would face, especially as the boy would soon start to show his character. He had grown up with an alcoholic mother, and his behavior was unpredictable. Despite potential issues, Shelley was not dissuaded. She believed that they could be each other's salvation in this harsh world. Like two wandering lights in the dark, Shelley and Kyle had found each other. Both had experienced loss, and they found solace in each other. Michelle grumbled, "You'll recover after breaking up with your terrible fiancé, but what's next? You might meet a decent man, want to start a family, but you already have a burden in the form of another's child. Can't you see that happening? Does he need a child that's not even his, Shelley?" "What are you talking about?" Shelley said with reproach. "Firstly, this child is not a stranger to me, and secondly, I'm not sure if I want to get involved with another man. Michelle, everything will be fine. Kyle and I are already attached to each other. Things won't worsen if I take custody of him. I don't regret saving him and getting close." Michelle only shook her head, refraining from further argument. Winter arrived almost unnoticeably. Shelley barely had time to adjust as the city dived into the pre-New Year's hustle. The adoption paperwork, due to some missing information in the certificates, was stopped. Shelley dreamed of spending Christmas and New Year with Kyle, but it seemed unlikely. She even began to feel that destiny was stopping her from adopting the boy. Why the need for such intrigue and drama, toying with my already frayed nerves? I even purchased a bed for Kyle, New Year's pyjamas and children's bedding, Shelley complained to the headmistress after receiving yet another refusal because her work certificate was outdated. It's unfortunate that he will have to spend this magical holiday here. Actually, the woman coughed softly and looked at her carefully. There is a way, although we are not usually encouraged to do this. Volunteers or staff occasionally take children to their homes for the weekend. We know you well enough that if you sign certain papers, we could arrange for you to spend the holidays together. Afterwards, you can obtain a new certificate from your work and return with the documents, assuming you still want to adopt the child. After all, raising such an active child is challenging. Over the holidays you can evaluate whether you and Kyle can live together. I won't change my mind, you can be sure of that. Shelley nodded and smiled broadly, anticipating Kyle's joy. Well, thank you for the offer. Now I need to go. I want to buy some warm clothes and a snowsuit for Kyle. And a Christmas tree. What is New Year's without a tree? I had already bought a set of cars for Kyle, but I don't have a Christmas tree to leave my gift. Inspired by the headmistress's offer, Shelley hurried to the bus stop, thinking about which shop she could go to that day. She probably wouldn't make it to the children's store today, so she planned to go the next morning. However, she could buy the tree now. She chose an artificial Christmas tree from a supermarket near her house and decided to buy the decorations the next day. She had never decorated a tree before and usually spent holidays with her mother and sister, but until the custody papers were sorted, Shelley couldn't take Kyle out of town. Nevertheless, the boy needed to experience the magical atmosphere of the Christmas and New Year, the same one that Shelley had loved and been inspired by in her childhood. Shelley was dragging a box with a tree in front of her. Every so often she peeked around it to navigate her path and avoid colliding with passers-by. However, she miscalculated and ran into someone. The loud reprimand made her shudder. Fearfully, Shelley peered from behind the box at the man she had inadvertently bumped into. It's a shame to hear such a nice voice used for scolding. She attempted to placate the stranger. It's also a shame for someone with such pleasant looks to lash out at strangers, the man retorted, his voice tinged with irritation. Shelley quickly retreated behind the box, her face flushing with embarrassment. In the dim light of the alleyway, the man couldn't see her scar. That's likely why he complimented her looks. Excuse me, Shelley peered out again. You suddenly appeared in my path. Can I pass by? She wanted to quickly diffuse the awkward situation. After all, he also should have been more aware of his surroundings. It was Shelley who had her view obstructed, not him. Her hands were freezing, despite wearing gloves. She felt cold and yearned for a cup of hot tea. Are you hurrying to bump into someone else? You were lucky it was me you hit. What if it had been a frail old lady? The man retorted. Shelley's hands were beginning to shake with fatigue, and she still had 3 or 4 more houses to pass. You're also at fault, by the way. Your view wasn't obstructed, and you saw where you were going. She tried to justify herself. Really? And you're so brave speaking from behind a box. Too afraid to look into the eyes of a man you nearly ran over? Is guilt eating you up? Shelley exhaled noisily and peeked out from behind the box. The man was looking at her with smiling eyes, the corners of which were lined with wrinkles. He seemed amused by the whole situation. Shelley was struggling to hold the box, and she was already regretting her decision to save money on a cab fare. Taking a deep breath, Shelley was ready to express her indignation at the man, but he reached for the box and wrapped his arms around it. Let me help.
Why are you so clinging to it? I'm not going to take away your burden. I'll just help you carry this home, then I'll leave. Shelley clung to the box even tighter and shook her head in refusal. After her fiancé's betrayal, Shelley wasn't used to accepting help from men. I won't let you endanger anyone else with that box. Either let me help you, or I'll call the police, said the man with a smile. The police? Shelley was stunned. I can't believe you decided to call the police. You heard right. The police. Or traffic officers. Whatever you prefer. You have violated a cardinal rule of the road. You are walking here without paying attention to the environment. You're a danger not only to yourself, but also to those around you. A smile appeared on her lips, which Shelley skillfully concealed. She found it amusing that he mentioned traffic police officers and a violated rule. After loosening her grip, Shelley realised the box had slipped from her hands. The stranger quickly hoisted it onto his shoulder. At first, Shelley feared it would fall, but he managed to hold it steady. He looked at Shelley, his eyes lingering on her scar. Out of habit, Shelley immediately looked away, hiding her face. And where are we going? Asked the man in a gruff voice. Straight ahead, 2 houses, then turn left. Past 1 more house and we'll be there. And you were going to carry this heavy load this far by yourself? The man grunted. Did he think she had a team of helpers waiting to assist? Shelley didn't respond, as the answer was quite obvious. In silence, they reached her house and stopped at the entrance. You won't let me carry this burden up to your apartment. Am I understanding that correctly? The man asked, squinting. You're a smart man, Shelley nodded with confidence. She didn't want to show the stranger where she lived. It sufficed that he knew her building and her entrance, and could easily trap her. At this moment, Ted and Paula emerged from the building. Ted glanced at Shelley, smirked, and sneered to Paula quietly. The ugly woman has found a new fiancé. They were about to walk past, but the stranger placed the box on the snow next to Shelley, grabbed Ted by the shirt, and forced him to meet his gaze. Apologize to the girl, growled the stranger, who happened to hear hurtful words. Paula screamed, attempting to summon help, but the area was deserted, and people were not keen to intervene. There's no need for that. Shelley tried to divert the man's attention and convince him to release Ted. Suddenly it occurred to her that Ted had deliberately chosen Paula to upset her more frequently and to regularly remind her of her worthlessness. It's necessary. Apologize, you jerk, before you're ploughing snow with your nose, the stranger repeated. Ted glanced at Shelley, then at Paula, and then back at Shelley, and finally mumbled an apology. Louder. She didn't hear. The stranger shook him. Sorry, Ted said with more confidence. Remember this next time you want to insult someone. Think 100 times, or you'll end up in an embarrassing situation again, the stranger warned. Then he let go of Ted, who left quickly, with Paula running after him, remarking that Shelley had found a suitor as disgusting as she was. But Shelley was not listening. She was looking at her defender. Thank you, she said. Rejected boyfriend? The man asked, gesturing in the direction Ted had left. More like it was me who was rejected, but that doesn't matter, she admitted. Should I invite you for tea, in gratitude for your defence? You don't owe me anything, the stranger replied and bid her good night. She returned his farewell and he left quickly, without sharing his name. However, Shelley's spirits were lifted. There were still some good people around, she thought. She picked up the box and went back to her apartment, thinking about Kyle's arrival the next day. She was slightly anxious, unsure of how he would react to her place. It was likely he would find it unusual at first, given his background. She had seen his previous living conditions, and knew her apartment would seem luxurious to him, but would he like it? As she sipped her hot tea, she thought again about the stranger who had stood up for her. For the first time in a while, she took a brave step.
She uncovered all the mirrors in her apartment and smiled at her reflection. Then she assembled the tree and set it up in the living room. Afterward, she fell into a peaceful sleep. In the morning, Shelley called her mother and sister, had a brief conversation, and promised to visit them with Kyle once all the paperwork would be completed. Sarah simply wished her daughter for everything to go well, and little Molly expressed her eagerness to meet Kyle. After the call, Shelley headed for shopping. She had plenty of time, as Kyle could only be picked up in the evening. At the mall, as she admired the bright toys and twinkling garlands, she inadvertently bumped into someone. She was extremely embarrassed. It was the second time in 24 hours she had done this. To her surprise, it was the same stranger from yesterday.
"You are making an attempt on my life," the man said confidently.
"No, I mean, oh, please forgive me." Shelley stumbled over her words.
"As an apology, you must tell me your name, so I know which woman to steer clear of," he responded.
"Shelley."
"Nice to meet you, Shelley, and my name is Jordan. I hope you won't try to knock me over again." Jordan laughed,
and Shelley joined him. "Of course not. I didn't mean to."
"I believe you, Shelley," Jordan nodded. "It's curious that we both decided to look at Christmas decorations at the last minute before the holiday."
Shelley didn't immediately understand exactly what Jordan meant, but then she nodded and smiled. "Just a change of circumstances," she replied.
"I understand. Circumstances can be elusive. I wanted to see if I could find a suitable gift, but nothing caught my eye."
Shelley nodded in agreement. Jordan and she walked through the aisles together. He assisted Shelley in choosing Christmas tree decorations and shared stories from his past. Shelley was engrossed in his stories, finding it surprisingly easy and enjoyable to converse with him, but this also made her feel uneasy. After her basket was full, Jordan offered to accompany Shelley home, reasoning that she wouldn't be able to carry such a heavy load by herself. Shelley accepted. Jordan drove her home in his car and helped carry the bags into her apartment. "Now, I just have to treat you to some tea, except I don't have anything for it, so I can offer just tea or coffee."
"I have a counter-proposal. Let's have lunch in a cafe. I have a rule, never accept invitations from women to have tea on their territory."
Shelley breathed a sigh of relief. This arrangement was easier for her. She felt uncomfortable having a man in her apartment, especially a stranger whom she barely knew. What did Shelley know about Jordan? Only his name and a few childhood stories. One was about how he got confused hanging garlands on a tree, and another was about how he purposely hid the star because he preferred the tree with an unadorned top. The cafe where Jordan took Shelley had a real Christmas atmosphere. It created the anticipation of the holiday, which Shelley always felt during her childhood. Shelley wanted to immerse herself in the magic of Christmas Eve and wished for the world to become a little brighter. "Where did you get that scar, Shelley?" asked Jordan suddenly. The woman flinched at his question, as if it were a physical blow. "Does it matter how I got it?" "No, of course it doesn't matter. You don't have to answer if you don't want to." Jordan shook his head. Shelley thought he seemed a little embarrassed. "I witnessed a fire and saved a child from the flames," Shelley replied. "You know, there's a story in almost every scar. I knew there was a heroic deed hidden in yours. I was not mistaken," Jordan responded. Feeling uneasy with the direction of the conversation, Shelley quickly diverted the topic. "Why do you decide not to accept an invitation to have tea at a girl's house?" she asked. "Oh, it's simple. I just don't want to embarrass anyone, and women's territory is sacred to them," Jordan replied. Shelley smiled and started eating her meal. After lunch, they were offered complimentary gingerbread cookies and hot chocolate. "Great place here, with always friendly atmosphere," praised Jordan. "Truly," Shelley nodded and took a crunchy bite of the little ginger man's leg. "And you, Shelley, are a cruel person," laughed Jordan, took a cookie and bit off the little man's head. And you decided to take his life at once, without giving him a chance, Shelley laughed.
At least it's less cruel. Would you agree?
Shelley shrugged and took a sip of the divine-tasting hot chocolate. Of course, no one would share the recipe, but Shelley would gladly write it down and try to learn how to make it the same way. The phone rang unexpectedly. It was the headmistress, who informed Shelley that everything was ready, and she could go to pick up Kyle. Jordan, thank you for a pleasant time, but I have to go on business.
Yes, me too. Thank you for having lunch with me.
Shelley called a cab and prepared for the long-awaited meeting, imagining how happy the boy would be when he found out that today they would leave together. The evening flew by unnoticed. Kyle was so happy that Shelley had taken him with her. He hugged Shelley for a long time in the cab and fell asleep in her arms, and then admired the apartment as if he were in another world. He played with the toys Shelley had brought for him. After dinner he fell asleep with a smile on his lips. Shelley realized that this was precisely how it had to be. There was a reason she met him and got to know him. It's scary to even imagine what would have happened to him if Ted had decided to park near his friend's house. Shelley went to sleep for the first time with a smile on her lips, reflecting on her time with Jordan and thinking about Kyle. Jordan seemed like a good man, but the woman was afraid to get attached and face disappointment again. So she told herself not to think about him. Plus, they hadn't even exchanged contacts, making it unlikely that they'd cross paths again. However, anything could happen, because life is unpredictable. Shelley woke up early in the morning to make breakfast. Pancakes were ready when Kyle woke up. After feeding him, Shelley invited him to decorate the tree while she prepared the vegetables for salad and marinated turkey. She decided not to cook too much. After all, it would only be Kyle and her, and Michelle was set to join them for the next day for tea and cake. Soon the apartment was aglow with multicoloured lights captivating Kyle. "Do you like it?" she asked with a smile. "Yes," the boy nodded. "It's so beautiful." "Yes, it is. Christmas Eve is magical, and Santa Claus can fulfill your deepest wish," she said. "I want to be with you," said Kyle, making Shelley's tears run down her cheeks instantly. "I want that very much too," she replied, not daring to tell Kyle that she was already doing everything possible for it. "Let's make a wish together." The boy nodded. A few hours passed. Shelley was doing the last preparations for the holiday, and little Kyle took a nap. Suddenly, someone knocking at the apartment door. Shelley went to open it before they woke up Kyle. He was sleeping so soundly and peacefully that she didn't want to disturb him. Seeing a dishevelled Jordan on the threshold, Shelley stepped back and looked at him apprehensively.
"Where is he?"
the man asked, looking at her intently. "Who? What happened, Jordan?" she asked, trying to understand everything. The man gently pushed Shelley aside as he entered the apartment, carefully moving his shoes at the doorstep. Although Shelley hadn't invited him in, she held back her indignation because Kyle emerged from the room rubbing his eyes. Seeing Jordan, the boy shrieked, "Daddy!" At that moment, Shelley's worst fears were confirmed. Kyle had called Jordan Daddy. She questioned why fate had brought her together with this man, forcing her to open up to him. Jordan swept Kyle into his arms, holding him tightly, and Shelley was on the verge of tears. Kyle pointed towards the living room and said, "The Christmas tree is over there." Jordan glanced at Shelley, seemingly seeking permission to proceed. The woman nodded. "Of course, you can go through." She realized that she would be spending this Christmas alone, as Kyle would be with his father. Shelley was tempted to ask what kind of father he was, having not thought about his son for so long. However, she held her tongue, as Kyle was overjoyed to see him. Looking at the screen of her phone, Shelley realized that the headmistress had called her to warn her about Kyle's father's arrival.
but Shelley was too busy to hear her calls. Nevertheless, she doubted knowing in advance would have made a difference. Shelley went to the kitchen and sat at the table, dreading a decision that could devastate her. About 15 minutes later, Jordan joined her at the table. He slumped, wrapping his arms around his head, and exhaled noisily. "You saved him, didn't you? My son?" the man asked, hesitating to meet Shelley's gaze. Shelley had never believed in such coincidences, but they did occur. It was overwhelming, and she felt on the verge of losing her sanity. "Are you going to take him away from me?" Jordan looked at her and shook his head. "Of course I want to take my son, but I don't want to take him away from you. I didn't know anything about the fire, not even that my ex-girlfriend is dead. We separated when my son was 6 months old because we couldn't see eye to eye. It was hard since I'm calm, and she was too explosive, too impulsive. We were not married because she constantly refused to marry me. Our child lived with her, and I was only allowed rare visits with her consent. She threw tantrums, demanded I see our son less often, that I stay out of his life. Sometimes we agreed to meet, but she wouldn't bring Kyle. I faithfully paid her the money. The situation distressed me and I moved up north for work. I realized I should have fought for my child. I always came for his birthday and New Year's Eve. Those were the days when I could be with my son, giving my ex money for her gifts. This morning she and Kyle were supposed to meet me at the mall. We had agreed on this a couple of months ago. I texted her, but she didn't respond. Out of anger, I decided to go to her house and sort things out, but found ruins instead. Your story flashed through my mind. I started asking neighbours. I found the orphanage where Kyle was placed, and they gave me your address. They told me that Kyle loves you like a mother, and you love him like a son. And I don't know what to do. I'm on the verge of losing it. I was supposed to fly back up north tomorrow, but now I can't. I can't leave my son. I can't burden you with this responsibility. I'll manage, Shelley replied emphatically. I believe you will definitely manage, but I want to be there for him. For you. Shelley felt as if she'd been electrocuted. You are gorgeous, but most importantly, you have an angelic soul. I noticed it that night when you almost hit me with your Christmas tree box. If you give me a chance to show myself, even the slightest chance. I don't know, Jordan. It's all happening too fast. Shelley shook her head. I'm not sure if it's right. It's silly to get together because we both want to be with Kyle. So you didn't like me? Jordan was a straight shooter. I didn't say this, but can't we take it slow? And why drag it out for years when it's already clear? I immediately felt the connection. But I'm not asking you to get into my bed and love me right away. Give me a chance to show myself and try. Currently, Kyle had shouted in the living room and Jordan and Shelley rushed to the sound of his voice. What happened? Shelley asked, looking around at Kyle. There are fireworks out there. He pointed to the window and the woman exhaled with relief, clutching the boy to her. Then she turned on cartoons for Kyle and went back to the kitchen to put the turkey in the oven. Jordan's proposal tugged at her heartstrings, as she found herself genuinely liking the man. But would he have offered a relationship if she hadn't saved his son? Freak! Ted's words echoed in her head. Setting the oven to the right temperature, Shelley stood up and faced Jordan. He caught her as she swayed, pulling her towards him. His eyes held nothing but adoration. But how could this be? Shelley couldn't fathom their mutual attraction, even though she felt herself drawn to him. She tiptoed up, and Jordan leaned in to meet her lips, when the doorbell rang again. Who could that be now? She rushed to open it, instantly finding herself in her mum's arms. Merry Christmas! We couldn't let you spend the holiday alone. Molly almost burst into the house and rushed in to hug her sister. Mum, why didn't you give us a heads up? Kyle and I could have met you. Nonsense, you're clearly busy. We've brought a ton of delicious food. Jordan peeked out from the kitchen, and Sarah looked at him in surprise. You didn't mention you would invite a man, the woman said, embarrassed. I didn't know either, Shelley shrugged. This is Kyle's father, Jordan. And your daughter's fiancé, Jordan quickly added. This surprised Shelley, because he had promised not to rush things. What's the rush when we barely know each other? Interesting details, but we'll have time to share everything later. For now, let's set the table. Christmas is almost here. Molly went to meet Kyle, and Sarah started unpacking the bags, recruiting Jordan and Shelley to help. As the clock struck midnight, Shelley made a wish for more kindness in the world and for things to work out for Jordan and her. A year later, they all gathered again as a big family. By then, Jordan and Shelley were married. She had adopted Kyle and was expecting a baby. Shelley made plastic surgery, although had learned to love herself in any state. As for Ted, Shelley heard from mutual acquaintances that he had fallen ill with a serious condition, leading him to drink heavily. He had abandoned his pregnant girlfriend Paula and refused to pay child support.
Well, we should toast to such an event, Simon suggested, quickly retrieving 2 glasses and a bottle of wine from the locker. Yes, it wasn't easy, but Curtis, we work honestly, and we know how to negotiate too. So this is a well-deserved victory, he added. He himself still couldn't believe they had managed such a successful deal. Yes, Curtis sighed, looking at his deputy. Simon, there's one thing I can't understand. If they were ready to sign the contract from the beginning, why all the theatrics? Probably to their self-esteem in their own eyes, Simon sighed back. Some people don't work in a straightforward manner. They want you to grovel and beg. All of this is nonsense, of course, but it's just the way it is. Curtis Burns had been in medium-sized business for over 7 years. His factory produced a variety of garden tools with a decent product range that saw the scale of production increase annually. Everything went smoothly with small wholesalers, but dealing with large chain stores was a different story. Negotiations took months and required a lot of effort. The wealthier the people were, the more petty and capricious they became, making them difficult to deal with. To our professionalism, Simon raised his glass. Curtis, stop worrying, everything's fine. I'm sorry, I'm exhausted, sighed the director. I'll probably head home. Okay, agreed Simon. If anything urgent comes up, I'll call you. Curtis made his rounds through the workshops and after ensuring everything was in order, headed to his car. Claudia, are you home? The man called his wife. I'll be home early today. Curtis, my mother and I are downtown. We decided to stroll around the city, his wife replied. We'll see you tonight. Curtis glanced at the clock. It was just past 3. He sighed. He would have loved to forget about everything and spend the rest of the day with Claudia, but she was out again. As he drove into his yard, he noticed his gardener busy in mowing. Hi, the owner greeted. Everything going well? Mr. Burns, good afternoon. The elderly man smiled broadly. You're home early today? Yes, I need some rest, Curtis replied. Why are you still here? He glanced at his watch. Well, Mrs. Bell wasn't happy with how I mowed the lawns. She made me do it again. Don't take it personally, Curtis answered, strolling through the garden. She always causes trouble for everyone. Go home. I'll talk to her. The elderly man picked up his lawnmower and walked towards the utility house. Curtis watched him go. Sarah Bell had been a thorn in his side for years. His mother-in-law had never been easy to get along with. She always wanted things her way, with no consideration for others. Curtis brewed some aromatic tea and retired to his study. The house was quiet, with only the cook preparing dinner in the kitchen. How I wish to forget everything for a while, Curtis voiced aloud. I'm so exhausted. He rested his head on the table. However, his brief respite was interrupted by a knock on the door after about 5 minutes. Startled, Curtis hastily smoothed his dishevelled hair and said to come in. Mr. Burns, I forgot to ask what we should do with the fish you brought, the cook inquired anxiously. Mrs. Bell had a fit this morning. She asked us to dispose of it. Why? Curtis was perplexed. It's fresh. I caught it just yesterday. I know, the cook replied dryly, but she did say that the whole house now smells of fish. Roger, please cook that fish for dinner, Curtis asked. I would enjoy it immensely. As for Sarah, she can eat whatever she prefers. I don't mind. Around 7 o'clock, faint noises began to emanate from downstairs, eventually escalating into the shrill squawking of the mother-in-law. I told you to throw that stinking fish away, she shrieked. Now the whole house reeks of it. What's the matter? Curtis descended into the living room. What's wrong? I asked Roger to cook fish for dinner. Curtis, you know I can't stand the smell of fish. Sarah turned up her nose. I'm going to be sick. Yes, honey, you're really behaving like a child. His wife also looked at him unhappily. It's interesting when your mother orders fish in a restaurant, it's okay, Curtis grumbled. But when I return from fishing, she can't wait to throw my fish away. But she doesn't sit in the restaurant kitchen where the fish is fried, Claudia said with reproach. Do you even care about my mum? Curtis said nothing in response, realizing that he would have his dinner with the cook in the kitchen. Roger, thank you from the bottom of my heart, he said 30 minutes later after finishing his meal. The fish is so delicious. After chatting with the man a little more, Curtis went up to his room, peeking into his wife's room on the way. He didn't understand how it happened, but he and his wife now had separate sleeping rooms. It was just that Claudia had insisted on it over time, saying that she couldn't sleep at all if someone else was sleeping in the room. Claudia, how are you? Curtis asked. What have you been doing today? He attempted to hug his wife, but she pulled away. You don't love my mum, she pouted. You're always yelling at her. Are you serious? The husband interjected in amazement. Claudia, what are you saying? When have I ever yelled at her? Instead of an answer, the woman remained silent, and Curtis, after waiting a little while, retreated to his room. Is this a normal family life? He muttered to himself. She has got her own room, I have mine. Sometimes I think it would have been better if I hadn't gotten married. The man lay in bed and closed his eyes, reminiscing his past. Curtis Burns stood in the centre of a large hall. The presentation had ended, and he was in discussion with a businessman who ran 3 garden stores and was interested in small wholesale purchases. Yes, I'm satisfied with your terms, the businessman said, so I'll drop by next week with my assistant. On a Wednesday, a familiar man appeared in Curtis's office, accompanied by a striking woman. Mr. Burns, this is Claudia, my assistant, the entrepreneur introduced. Throughout the contract discussion, Curtis found his gaze returning to Claudia, though she seemed not to notice. Well, I suggest we finish our meeting with lunch at a nice place, Curtis said when the business was concluded. The entrepreneur agreed, and they all headed to the nearest restaurant. After lunch, Curtis became even more interested in Claudia, and to his delight, a few days later, the businessman sent her to Curtis with documents, and Curtis seized this chance to get to know the woman better. May I invite you to lunch? Curtis asked shyly. Please don't refuse me. However, Claudia declined, explaining she had to return to work. What about the weekend? Curtis asked, looking her squarely in the eye. We won't talk business, just a friendly meeting. Claudia hesitated. What was in her head, Curtis did not know, but she, to his delight, still agreed. At their meeting in the cafe on the weekend, Curtis asked her what she does besides work. I won't lie, work consumes all my time, Claudia sighed. I live with my sick mother. I need to work hard to support us both." "What's wrong with her?" Curtis inquired. "Is it something serious? Is she in the hospital?" "She has a thyroid problem," Claudia replied. "She relies on medication, which is expensive." "I'm sorry." Curtis sighed. "Claudia, is there anything I can do to help?" "What could you possibly help me with?" she retorted, with a hint of irritation in her voice. "If I could find a better-paying job, I would have left my secretary position long ago. Not only is the pay low, it drains my energy." "I understand," Curtis sighed. "Generally there is no such thing as a perfect job. Problems exist everywhere." After meeting Claudia, Curtis pondered about how to help her and considered offering her a position in his company. However, things didn't go that way. Following their initial encounter, they had more meetings, but before he knew it, Curtis found himself falling for Claudia. He wondered what drew him to her. Was it her efficiency, or perhaps her distant demeanour? She wasn't flirting with him, hinting at anything, or seeming to care. Nonetheless, after 2 months of dating, Curtis confessed his love for her. Claudia was extremely flustered and didn't respond immediately, asking him to wait instead. For 2 weeks, Curtis was in agony. When Sarah eventually called to say yes, he felt like the happiest man on earth. "Curtis, but you need to meet my mum," Claudia said afterward. "I've already told her that we're in a serious relationship." "I don't mind," he agreed. "Let me invite both of you to my place for dinner. I'll arrange everything. It will be better than the most expensive restaurant." Curtis was very worried, understanding that his life probably depended on this meeting. However, he didn't like Sarah from their first meeting. She behaved arrogantly and slyly. "Curtis, what a terrific house you have!" Sarah looked around enthusiastically. "You can be envied. Not like me and Claudia living in a one-room apartment. If I could work, we might be able to buy a house, but my poor girl has to work so hard to provide for us." As for Claudia, she remained silent for most of the evening. It seemed to Curtis that she was thinking about something. "Claudia, is there something wrong with you?" he asked finally, unable to keep his anxiety. "You look very preoccupied." "Yes, I've had some difficulties at work. There's a paperwork issue to be resolved," she said calmly. "I'm sorry. I want so much to forget about everything, but nothing works." "Yes, work takes up a lot of time and energy. That's why I decided a long time ago that my wife will not work," Curtis said. "That's very commendable," Claudia's mother said. "Only truly loving husbands can respect their wives like that." Claudia blushed, but after this meeting, Curtis decided for himself that she would become his wife. Their wedding was held with great fanfare. On the bride's side was only her mother and a few friends. After the wedding, Claudia and her mother moved to Curtis. Curtis immediately asked his wife not to work, and initially it caused many disagreements. "Curtis, I can't just stay within these 4 walls," Claudia protested. "If you don't want me to work, at least let me volunteer." "And do what? Deliver food to the poor?" Curtis questioned. "There are many things one can do," she objected. "I could organise holidays for sick children, buy them gifts, clothes. I could even sponsor a few families and offer them support." "If that's what you want," Curtis conceded, "then fine. Just tell me how much money you'll need each month." "I've already worked it out," replied Claudia, and Curtis looked at her bewildered. "What did you expect?" she asked, noticing his surprise. "Stores aren't going to give me anything for free." "All right," the man sighed. "If it makes you happy, we'll do it." Claudia, overjoyed, hugged him tightly. Thus, she started a small charity foundation and spent most of her days working, rarely being home. The first few months, Curtis just flew from happiness, but then Sarah took household chores in her hands, and in the house you could constantly hear her disgruntled voice. Curtis tried to talk to her, but she immediately became ill and after that Claudia arranged a scandal for Curtis. "Curtis, you know she has thyroid problems," his wife scolded. "She has an unstable emotional background, so she sometimes loses her temper. But she doesn't scream like crazy. She just makes remarks to the servants." And for a year, Curtis let it all happen. But then once, the mother-in-law fired the maid over a fault known only to her. Curtis sighed but didn't intervene. 3 days later, he was in his study when he heard voices downstairs. Sarah was speaking unpleasantly to a stranger, a woman who looked around 27 to 30 years old. "If you are not ready to stay after work and correct your mistakes," Curtis heard, "then you are not suitable for us." "I treat my work diligently. I know my job and I have experience. Why do you think I will be bad at cleaning?" the woman timidly replied. "Because for the salary I offer, everything should be beyond perfect," Sarah said angrily and gestured for the guest to leave the house. The woman hesitated for a few seconds, clutching her bag, then headed for the front door. "Wait a minute, you're hired," Curtis said loudly, and staring intently at his mother-in-law, added, "I am the master here." Sarah wanted to object, but fear held her back. Her face reddened as anger surged within her. "There will be no overtime work for you," Curtis reassured the poor woman. "Even if you make mistakes, it's no big deal. I won't keep you working late." "Curtis, can't you see this person is not right for us?" the mother-in-law finally blurted out. "I'm better at housekeeping than you are." Ignoring his mother-in-law, Curtis asked the guest, "What's your name?" "Abby," the woman replied timidly. "I have references. I've worked as a maid for 3 years." "If you're ready, you can start today," Curtis stated calmly before leaving the room. Sarah glared at Abby with such hatred that the woman shuddered. "Abby," the cook advised her that day, "our boss is a good man. His mother-in-law is difficult, but if he hired you personally, you have nothing to fear." The next day, Sarah gestured around the room arrogantly and said, "Yesterday you cleaned the living room poorly." Abby looked at her in bewilderment. That day, Sarah followed her around, trying to wear her out so she wouldn't return to work the next day. Of course, such thoughts had already begun to creep into Abby's mind. But this morning, just before her meeting with Sarah, she had bumped into Curtis in the hallway, and he'd given her the strength to continue her work in peace. "Abby, don't worry about what Sarah wants," Curtis had advised before leaving. "I hired you, so I'm responsible for you. Don't be afraid of her." During lunch, the landlady deliberately spilled tea on the carpet and threw a tantrum. "This stain wasn't here 10 minutes ago. You did it now," Abby responded calmly. "How dare you accuse me?" Sarah shouted. "You're nobody here." Abby didn't respond. Instead, she began to clean the stain while the woman continued to yell. Almost 2 years have passed, and Sarah hasn't been able to dismiss anyone since that incident. Meanwhile, Curtis felt a tinge of embarrassment over his inner discontent. He enjoyed all the privileges one could only dream of. Moreover, Claudia proved to be very calm and intelligent. She seldom argued with him. Curtis frequently took her to various gatherings and often heard complimentary remarks about her. "Mr. Burns, your wife is divine. For such a woman, any man would move mountains," a partner once remarked. But Claudia never gave Curtis any reason to doubt her. Their only disagreements arose due to her mother. But Curtis eventually stopped paying attention to that too. The only concern he had was the absence of children. "Curtis, don't panic. It's just not the right time yet," his wife used to assure him once. In such thoughts, Curtis eventually fell into a restless sleep, tossing and turning, repeatedly waking up. "When will I finally get some sleep?" he grumbled as he got up in the morning. It was one of the rare days they had breakfast together as a family, because normally Claudia was usually still asleep when her husband left for work. "How about we go out this weekend?" Curtis suggested.
It's been a while since we had a day out.
Sure, Claudia agreed. Let's try go-karting. I've been a few times and really enjoyed it.
You want to go go-karting?
Well, I don't mind.
Sarah, will you join us?
God forbid, his mother-in-law refused, waving her hands dismissively.
Don't even try to persuade me.
All right then, it's just the two of us. We'll race each other. Claudia laughed. Curtis eagerly awaited their trip to the go-kart track. Claudia asked him to rent the entire track for an hour to avoid any interruptions, and Curtis agreed with pleasure. As they drove out of town in the warm September weather, both were filled with anticipation and rubbed their hands together in excitement.
And what prize do I get if I beat you? Curtis asked, his eyes sparkling. Will you fulfill any of my requests?
All right, Claudia responded coquettishly. But first, try to beat me. I'm confident you won't be able to. Upon arriving, Curtis parked their car and joined his wife in heading towards the empty kart track. Shortly after, a sturdy young man approached them.
This one's for you, Mr. Burns.
He gestured towards one of the racing carts.
And this pink one is for your wife.
Curtis quickly jumped into his cart, responding,
Watch what I'm about to do. I will definitely beat you.
Claudia and Curtis started their cars simultaneously, with Curtis giving Claudia a slight head start. Claudia took her time, not wanting to drive at full speed. They completed a few laps in this manner before Curtis began to accelerate, eventually catching up with Claudia and overtaking her on a turn. Claudia attempted to regain her lead. Curtis himself didn't realise what happened next. He only felt that the cart had stopped obeying him, and after a moment he felt a somersault, then another. Then the cart crashed into the tyres and pushed them forward. Everything was spinning before Curtis's eyes. He tried to exit the car, but found himself unable to move. He could hear voices around him. Everything blurred before he lost consciousness. 20 minutes later, an ambulance arrived, and he was taken to the hospital. His wife was fussing with the doctors, crying, asking them something. "Will he live?" Curtis heard someone's question. He himself was unable to open his eyes. His body felt lifeless.
"I don't know yet," replied a doctor. "We're doing everything we can."
Curtis had a vague recollection of what happened next. He would drift in and out of consciousness, hearing murmurs of voices nearby. "He overcorrected and lost control," Claudia's voice echoed. 3 days later. 3 days later, Curtis finally regained consciousness. He was alone. He moved his lips, calling out. A woman in a white robe approached.
"What happened to me?"
he asked the doctor, struggling.
"My wife and I were go-karting."
"Sadly, you had a crash," the doctor replied.
"It's rare, but you were lucky. It could have been fatal."
"When can I leave? I want to stand up," Curtis asked. "I think I can't feel my legs."
"Regrettably, your spine is severely damaged." The doctor sighed. "It's unlikely you'll be able to walk. Be thankful you're still alive. None of us could offer any guarantees at the start."
Curtis remained silent, gazing pleadingly at the doctor as tears streamed down his cheeks. In the evening, Claudia arrived, already aware of his situation, and crying incessantly.
"Forgive me, Curtis. It's all my fault," she sobbed. "Why did I suggest we go there? I ruined you."
"Claudia, it's not your fault," her husband reassured her. "I was the one who stepped on the gas. It was all my fault."
Claudia, however, was inconsolable, appearing on the verge of hysteria. Curtis felt uncomfortable. He didn't want to see anyone, and Claudia's hysterics either. Meanwhile, Curtis gathered all his will in a fist and ordered himself to live on. While still in the hospital, he resumed work. His deputy Simon visited him, and they discussed as many work points as possible. Curtis was discharged from the hospital after 2 months and began a new chapter in his life. He was not planning to leave his job. He hired a reliable driver to transport him to the factory. Working from a wheelchair was challenging, but Curtis persevered. The office was equipped with ramps for him to navigate independently in his wheelchair. An assistant was always present to help with his daily tasks. Curtis despised being pitied and was deeply hurt by sympathetic looks.
"Simon," he once told to his deputy, "I am not a defenceless creature. I will cope. I will never quit my work."
Changes were also happening at Curtis's home. His wife began to distance herself. "Curtis, I closed my foundation," she once told him. "Let's try to go abroad for rehabilitation."
"Claudia, it won't help me," he replied. "I'll never walk again, and we just need to learn to live with it."
His mother-in-law became increasingly quiet around him. It seemed that neither his wife nor his mother-in-law knew what to do next.
"Abby," he once asked his maid, "I need your help during the day. I can't go to work every day, so I need a reliable person at home. You've been with us for years, and I trust you completely. I'll find someone else for the cleaning."
"All right, Mr. Burns," the woman smiled. "Just explain what I need to do."
"Soon my house will be fully wheelchair accessible, and then I will require an attendant and an assistant," Curtis explained. "The responsibilities are the same as any care for a man in a wheelchair. I'm sorry, but I can't ask anyone else for this job."
The woman agreed and immediately started her new duties.
"Abby, why haven't you vacuumed the living room yet?"
Sarah complained when the ex-maid descended from the second floor. "I'm sorry, but Mr. Burns hired me as his assistant," Abby replied calmly. "I don't work as a cleaner anymore," she added, blushing.
"You've been such a headache," Sarah hissed like a snake. "I would have fired you long ago."
Abby did not respond, instead heading to the kitchen to make tea for her employer, while Curtis's mother-in-law watched her with a disgruntled look, deep in thought. Several months passed since the accident, and Curtis began to notice that his wife was becoming distant. Although she had closed her foundation, she continued to sponsor several families and spent her evenings working.
"Claudia, you and I haven't talked in a long time," Curtis said to her one evening. "Did something happen to you?"
"Curtis, I still can't forgive myself," she cried. "When I look at you, I don't want to live."
"Claudia, honey, you should be happy that I'm alive."
Curtis smiled gently.
"Well, come to me. I missed you so much."
He took her hand and went to his room. The woman kissed her husband without much enthusiasm, and Curtis felt it. It made him feel even more painful, and he told himself that he would no longer insist on their intimacy. But deep down, he wished that Claudia's love would not only not fade because he was confined to a wheelchair, but would also flare up with renewed vigour. Curtis himself did not understand where he got such moral strength. Instead of sobbing, he smiled. When he had a strong desire inside him to give up everything and end his life, he would take up some new endeavour.
"Abby, why don't we take a trip to some museum?"
Curtis once suggested to his helper.
"You'll laugh, but I want to go to the Paleontological Museum."
"All right," Abby smiled with enthusiasm. "Frankly speaking, I've never been there."
"That's it. Now we definitely need to go there," smiled the man. "I'm sure you'll love it there."
On Saturday, the driver took Curtis and his assistant to the museum. Despite it being a weekend, the museum was not crowded. Most people seemed eager to enter the dinosaur hall. Upon seeing Abby's surprised face, Curtis laughed and asked,
"What do you think? Look at that giant."
"Frankly, I'm relieved we weren't around during their time," responded Abby, her lips pale. "If I had seen it in person, I might have gone mad."
"Well, not all of them were predators," Curtis countered. "Many were herbivores. We could have ended up in their stomachs like unnoticed bugs on vegetable leaves. But I don't think they would have preyed on us. There were vast forests. They had plenty of food. For nearly 3 hours they examined the museum's most fascinating exhibits, with Curtis providing commentary throughout. Later, on the way home, the man exclaimed, "What a fantastic day off! It may sound odd, but only when I was confined to a wheelchair did I truly start to value life, each moment of it. Now I'm less fearful of losing anything." Abby smiled, reflecting on her simple life. She lived in a rented apartment and her paycheck was divided in half, one part for her parents and the other for her own expenses. In essence, she had nothing to lose. Meanwhile, they arrived home in high spirits. Claudia was already home and Curtis approached his wife. "Honey, I'd like to invite you to a romantic dinner." Saying this, he got slightly anxious because Claudia looked at him in surprise, awaiting further explanation. "I'm going to get us a suite in a classy hotel and organise a romantic evening for us," Curtis said with hope in his voice. "I just thought it would be nice to spend the evening outside our home." "All right," Claudia smiled. "Let's consider it a date. I'll come to the hotel and you'll wait for me there." "With flowers?" Curtis took his wife's hand. "I love you. I promise you won't regret it." Curtis spent most of the night worrying. He was filled with anticipation because he had waited too long for Claudia to finally accept what had happened and return her love to him. "I'll order a huge bouquet of red roses," Curtis planned. "We'll have champagne and fruit brought to our room." Towards morning he fell asleep and dreamed of Claudia holding roses. He woke up around 11 o'clock. He rang the bell and Abby entered his room. She noticed Curtis's worried look and asked anxiously, "Is something wrong? May I help you?" "Yes," Curtis replied immediately. "Abby, please order a huge bouquet of red roses and prepare some clothes for going to the restaurant." "Are we going somewhere today? Do you have an appointment?" the woman asked, smiling. "I have a romantic dinner with my wife tonight," Curtis said cheerfully. "Abby, can I ask you one more thing? I let my driver go today. Could you take a cab with me to the hotel? And from there, I'll come with Claudia." "Of course I'll come with you," Abby agreed. "Don't worry, I'll take care of everything." However, Curtis was very nervous and restless. At 6 p.m, he and Abby took a cab. He agreed with his wife that he would go to the hotel early and wait for her there. She was expected to arrive by 8 o'clock. In the room, Abby helped Curtis settle in, put the flowers in water, and ensured everything was in order. She bid her host goodbye and left. "See you tomorrow, Mr. Burns," she said before leaving. The woman came out of the large, beautiful hotel building and looked up. Somewhere there was Curtis. Right in front of the hotel was a small cafe, and Abby decided to have a cup of tea. She savoured her favourite custard cakes with cream, when suddenly she noticed Claudia's car parked 300 metres from the hotel. At this moment, Claudia herself and an unknown man stepped out, and after a brief conversation, she kissed the stranger. Abby, taken aback, watched as another car pulled up, and the man got in. Claudia waved in the direction of the car and then headed into the hotel. Who was that? Abby's heart pounded. Judging by that kiss, he wasn't just a friend. Confused and concerned, Abby's thoughts turned to Curtis. He was a kind man who never harmed anyone, and she felt an obligation to protect him. A sense of impending trouble loomed over her. The cafe was open until 3 a.m, and Abby ended up drinking about 10 mugs of tea throughout the night. She struggled to stay awake despite her exhaustion. Her intuition of danger kept her alert. Almost at 3 o'clock in the morning, she saw as Claudia hurriedly left the hotel, got into her car and drove off. And where is Curtis? The caregiver couldn't help but wonder. As she began to gather her items,
the hotel's front door opened and the guard assisted Curtis in exiting onto the street. Abby sighed with relief. She was hastily dressing as she walked when, just a few meters from the exit from the cafe, she saw a car swiftly pull up to the hotel. 2 men jumped out, quickly bundled Curtis into the car, and drove away. "Stop!" Abby shouted after the departing car, but it was too far away and it was quite dark outside. "What am I going to do?" she said to herself, almost crying out of helplessness. At this moment, a taxi pulled up to the hotel, and Abby immediately rushed towards it. "Please, let's go," she implored. "I'll pay double the fare." The driver was initially reluctant, but acquiesced when he heard the amount she offered. "We need to find a black Jeep," Abby instructed. "Let's head towards the highway. I'm sure they've left town." Her intuition did not fail her, and very soon they spotted a familiar car. Abby asked the driver to keep a distance. They drove for approximately an hour, and then the Jeep veered off the road. "There's a forest there," the taxi driver responded to her request to follow the Jeep. "There's no road, just a dirt path." Abby was uncertain of what frightened her more, the darkness and wolves, or the possibility of finding her employer dead. Handing over the fare, she hurried into the forest. She crept carefully behind the first rows of trees until she reached the dirt road where the black Land Rover had turned off. She hid inside huge bushes, and 20 minutes later she saw the car return to the road and head back towards the town. Who are these people? What have they done to him? Abby cautiously navigated through the bushes. Her legs trembled as the sound of howling wolves filled the air, but an inner certainty that Curtis was alive propelled her forward, despite her fear. "Lord, help me," Abby whispered. "Please, help me find him." "Curtis! Curtis!" she called out as loud as she could. "Curtis, where are you?" But there was only silence in return. Tears streamed down her cheeks as she received no response. She began peering into the bushes when she noticed one area where the branches were bent to the ground. With trembling legs, she moved in that direction while the howling of wolves grew louder. "Curtis!" she shouted at the top of her voice. "Where are you? Please answer me." After about 5 minutes, she reached a small clearing. The area was brighter and she could see the clear outlines of trees. Something was lying near one of them. "Curtis!" she cried out and rushed forward. "Please hang on, I'm coming," she urged, clutching at the branches of the bushes for support. She crawled to a wheelchair, near which a man was lying. He was staring upwards with unseeing eyes. Instinctively, she pulled out her cell phone. Initially, Abby wanted to call the police and an ambulance. Additionally, she needed to inform his wife. "I don't even know where we are, so I need to take him to the hospital first." Abby struggled to her feet, and after some effort she succeeded. She placed Curtis on her cloak and dragged him to the highway, where she hailed a car. The driver assisted in loading Curtis into the car and drove them to the nearest hospital. The doctor immediately examined Curtis. Though there were no visible signs of violence, his weak heart rhythm indicated that he had been drugged. Miraculously, Curtis survived, regaining consciousness 3 days later. During these days, Abby was anxious. It was odd that none of Curtis's relatives had contacted her, so she called the cook. "Abby, none of the owners are home. 3 days ago Mrs. Bell got sick and was taken to some private clinic, and Claudia's been with her ever since. I don't know where Mr. Burns is, and they gave me a week off." After hanging up the phone, Abby realised she would have to wait for Curtis to come to his senses and start communicating properly. Then, perhaps, things would become clearer. "Abby, what are you doing here? Where am I?" Curtis asked, looking around. "Am I in the hospital?" "Yes, Mr. Burns. What happened to you?" She looked intently into his eyes. "Do you remember being kidnapped?" Bewildered, Curtis looked at Abby as if he was trying to rewind time. When he finally remembered, he shuddered. "Abby, I left the hotel and was waiting for a cab, and then someone pulled me into a car.
I felt a prick, and everything after that was like a dream," Curtis said, his face covered in sweat.
"Have you seen these people?"
Abby asked quietly, attempting not to attract attention.
"Do you know them?"
"No," Curtis replied thoughtfully, turning pale. "I believe they intended to kill me."
"I found you in the forest," Abby began.
"There were wolves present. It's possible they planned for the wolves to maul you in a few days, ensuring nobody would ever discover how you ended up there."
"Abby, how did you find me?" Curtis asked, astonished.
Only now was he beginning to grasp the meaning of her words.
"I'm sorry, but I followed you," Abby admitted, lowering her head. "After leaving the hotel, I decided to have tea in the cafe across the street. I was very tired that day, but when I saw your wife arrive, and not alone, I feared for you."
"Not alone? What do you mean?" He stared intently into Abby's eyes.
"I won't lie. There was a man with her. I didn't see his face," the woman replied, "but I can assure you they were kissing. Then a car pulled up and the man got in." "Abby, are you sure?" Curtis said, horrified. "Maybe you imagined the whole thing. You see," he lowered his eyes bashfully, "my wife and I had a wonderful romantic evening. We planned to return home in the morning, but my mother-in-law called at 4 o'clock saying she was literally dying. Claudia left me right away to go straight home, not to lose time with me. I had to call a cab and come back myself. You know the rest."
Abby sighed and told her boss what she had learned from his cook.
"I think someone intended to kill you," the woman said, taking his hand. "Mr. Burns, it's dangerous for you to return home now. Let it go the way it's going. We should keep it a secret that you're alive for a while and see how things develop. Someone's bound to give themselves away, otherwise they'll find you, and this time they might not spare your life."
"Oh my goodness, I can't understand why," Curtis murmured. "I haven't wronged anyone. Why would they want to kill me? And in such a gruesome way? That's absurd."
"Mr. Burns, were you aware that Claudia was seeing someone?" Abby suddenly asked.
"Abby, I apologize, but I still believe you're mistaken." The man scrutinized her. "Just because she had a man in her car doesn't imply anything. Claudia interacts with people regularly, but the idea that she kissed him, I'm convinced that's just your imagination."
The woman looked at him and didn't respond. She understood that without solid evidence, she wouldn't be able to convince him of anything. "Mr. Burns, you'll be discharged in a few days, and you need to lay low."
"But where?" The man pondered. "I may rent a place to stay for a couple of months if you'll assist me with that. Take the credit card in my wallet. I'll give you the PIN. Please find the apartment for me."
"Don't worry, I won't leave you," the woman smiled. "Take my old phone. It's risky to call from yours in case it's been compromised. If you encounter any problems, call me immediately. My new number is saved there." Curtis looked at her in surprise. Despite everything he had experienced, he still couldn't fathom that this wasn't all some elaborate prank, and he was genuinely in danger. After Abby departed, Curtis became lost in his thoughts. He mentally reviewed all his partners and competitors, wondering who could have betrayed him. However, none of them seemed to care about his fate. His suspicion then shifted towards his subordinates. Could Simon have done this? A thought popped into Curtis's head. We've worked together for years. He's reliable. I can't see into his soul, though. Even if I entertain the idea that he did it, what's his motive? To take over the factory? Curtis tiredly rubbed his temples. His head was spinning, but he needed to continue this internal investigation. Okay, let's consider Claudia and her mother. Curtis sighed. They've lived comfortably, spending money without a care. What are they missing? They had everything. Does Claudia have a secret lover? After the passionate night we spent at the hotel, I doubt it. Perhaps Abby saw someone she recognized kissing Claudia on the cheek, especially since it was already dark.
Regardless, I miss her dearly. That was the most passionate night of our marriage. I finally understood how much Claudia loves me. She must be worried sick about me. How do I let her know I'm okay? I bet she has already tried calling me hundreds of times."
Curtis was conflicted. He took the phone that Abby had left him and was about to call when he decided against it.
"Love, I'm fine, don't worry," he texted.
A minute later, his phone rang. Despite Claudia's multiple attempts to reach him, he resisted answering. Then a message from her arrived. "Curtis, I'm losing my mind from worries. I was going to go to the police," his wife texted.
"You don't need to involve the police. I'll find you when everything is settled," he texted back.
Claudia tried to call Curtis again, but he still didn't answer. The next day, Abby quickly found suitable lodging, paid the landlady, and headed straight to the hospital with the keys. She came into the ward and noticed that Curtis was awake now.
"Abby, I believe the only one who could have done this is Simon, my deputy," Curtis whispered, "but I can't fathom his motive."
"Mr. Burns, let's not jump to conclusions," Abby replied in a matter-of-fact tone. "Tomorrow I'll pick you up and we'll move to your new apartment. We'll have to buy you some new clothes. I'll also pick up a new wheelchair. I've already arranged for that."
"Abby, thank you," Curtis said, his eyes filling with tears. "You've saved me more than once."
"It'll be okay," she reassured him, gently stroking his head. "The important thing is that no one knows where you are right now. I believe we'll have some leads soon."
"Shouldn't we report this to the police? At least they can protect me," her man offered.
"I wouldn't get my hopes up," the woman replied coldly. "You can bribe anyone these days, there's no guarantee."
"Nevertheless, I can't understand who I could have offended," Curtis sighed. "I've never wronged anyone, cheated, or had an affair with another man's wife. Why would anyone be mad at me?"
Late that night, Abby returned to her apartment and collapsed onto the bed. She didn't sleep for long, though. Her alarm clock rang at 8 and she began to prepare for the day. She bought food and necessary items for Curtis. By noon, she got him to his temporary dwelling. "Well, this is our new home," Abby said as she navigated the wheelchair into the apartment. "It's a good place with thresholds, so you can move around easily. Just don't go too fast," she joked.
"I once lived life in the fast lane at my wonderful big house, and now I'm in a wheelchair in a tiny apartment."
Curtis sighed.
"Abby, thank you. I can't express how grateful I am."
"When this is all over, you'll take me to a museum." She laughed.
"I've always enjoyed those outings with you." "I promise," Curtis replied with a broad smile. "We'll visit the most fascinating museums."
Abby prepared dinner, and after enjoying the meal, she helped Curtis get settled in bed. She then retreated to the couch. "Finally I can sleep. Tomorrow we'll figure out the next steps," she thought before drifting off. The following day, Curtis asked Abby to visit his factory. He had a reliable person there who could tell him about the real situation there. Without hesitation, Abby left her boss for his errands. At the gatehouse, Abby gave the guard the reliable person's name, and soon an elderly man appeared. Abby ushered him aside, explaining she represented Mr. Burns, and asked about the last factory happenings.
"Nothing unusual," the man replied, bewildered. "Everything at the factory is calm. Work continues as usual."
"Is your deputy trustworthy?" Abby asked cautiously.
"Simon?" The man seemed surprised. "I've worked for Mr. Burns for many years and never had any issues with his deputy. He's a good man."
Abby exhausted her questions for this man, and asking him to keep their conversation confidential for now, she went home. Meanwhile, Curtis was alone, his mind in turmoil. Torn between reporting to the police immediately and waiting a bit longer, he found himself fiddling with Abby's phone, and eventually he gave in to his secret desire.
"Claudia, my love," he dialed his wife. I want you to know that I'm okay. I've missed you so much."
"Curtis, where are you?" An agitated voice responded immediately. "I've almost lost my mum, and now I don't even know where you are."
"You see, someone wanted to kill me," Curtis said. "That's why I'm forced to hide for now. I suspect Simon."
"Kill you?" Claudia's voice trembled. "You know, a few days ago a man called us on your behalf and said that you were away for a week or two, that you would call afterward. That's why I was calm and spent all those days with my mum without worrying about you. And why did I leave you that night? I should have waited for you, and we could have gone home together. It's my fault again. I'm begging you, please tell me where you are. I promise no one will ever know. I'll only come to see you for a few minutes." Curtis felt so painful that he couldn't stand it and told Claudia his address. After his conversation, he dialed up to Abby and asked her to watch Simon for a while. In fact, he just didn't want her to discover that he revealed his new place to his wife. All these days, Curtis missed Claudia deeply, constantly reminiscing their last evening together. He felt his love for his wife intensify, causing his body to tremble in anticipation of their reunion. Curtis was in the kitchen when the doorbell rang. He went to answer it and was met by two men who rushed into the apartment. One of them injected something into Curtis's arm, causing him to lose consciousness almost instantly, and then they swiftly carried him out like a piece of furniture. Abby had been waiting outside the factory for 4 hours. She was freezing, but Simon never came out. Exhausted, she dialed Curtis's number, but he didn't answer. After about 10 minutes, she tried calling him again. Abby grew concerned and hailed a taxi. She needed to get home quickly. The closer Abby got to the house, the more her anxiety grew. She paid the taxi driver and sprinted towards the elevator. She rang the doorbell, but there was no answer. Standing rooted to the spot, she instinctively tried the door handle and found it open. With shaky legs, she entered the apartment. Curtis was nowhere to be found. The woman quickly grabbed her phone, intending to call the police. However, she decided against it and headed to her boss's house. "I'm sure Claudia's involved in this. If they killed him, they're probably trying to hide the evidence now," Abby reasoned. "While I'm telling the police, they might just sweep everything under the rug, and the guilty party will never be found." It was already dark, but Abby saw very well what was happening in Claudia's bedroom because the curtains there were left open, revealing a distinct male silhouette. "That's definitely not Curtis," Abby whispered to herself. "Who could be in her room? Given that the kitchen light is off, it seems none of the workers are present." Gradually, some pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place, but she still couldn't understand who the main villain in this story was. The woman called a cab, paid the driver for the night, and prepared to wait. At 3 o'clock, a car with Claudia and that strange man left Curtis's house. The cab driver and Abby followed them. Soon, Claudia stopped at some bridge and with her passenger got into an old rusty car that was parked there. That car drove towards the suburbs, and Abby and the cab driver followed it. Abby understood the danger of her surveillance, but she felt she had to take the risk again. However, she was so tense that she didn't even realize where they had gone. After probably 30 minutes, the driver dropped Abby off on a deserted street. He was too scared to continue. Abby wandered the dark streets, straining to hear the car. She felt an overwhelming fear that made her body tremble. The barking of dogs echoed in the distance. Eventually, she found herself at the edge of the suburb. Suddenly, a car's headlights flashed on near the outermost house. Quickly, Abby hid behind the end of a brick wall, and the same old car drove by her. "He must be there," she whispered to herself. "But what do I do now? If they've brought Curtis here, there might be someone guarding him. They might even kill me too." And finally she called the police. The policeman listened reluctantly, promising that someone would come. The woman wrapped herself in her demi-seasonal raincoat and waited. An hour passed, then 2, but no one came. As dawn broke, Abby called the police again.
The same disgruntled voice curtly informed her that the police had almost arrived on the scene. Cautiously, Abby started towards the house. It was eerily quiet and the surrounding houses appeared uninhabited. As she approached the gate, a large dog lunged at her. She was fortunate that it was on a chain. Startled, Abby decided to wait for the police. Cold shivers racked her body, and to warm up she began to move around, which provoked the dog further. It pulled at its chain with such force that Abby feared it would break loose. Finally, she spotted a police car in the distance. Paul started dating Claudia when she turned 18. Paul was resourceful and made good money, but it was only after several years together that Claudia learned that Paul was in a gang. He never got his hands dirty, but was involved in kidnappings, extortion and intimidation. When the police got on their trail, criminal charges were filed against many of the gang members. For about a month they tried to negotiate with the police chief, but Paul knew that even if they were let go, they couldn't continue their previous lifestyle. They would inevitably get caught eventually, and Paul managed to secure his freedom by framing his accomplices and moving to the capital. The young couple, along with Sarah, rented an apartment. They were cautious to avoid attracting attention. Claudia secured a job as a secretary and performed well. Paul worked as a driver delivering goods to stores. A year later it was evident that Paul was not being pursued by his former accomplices, and he became more relaxed. "We can't live on our salaries if we want a normal life," Paul noted, "especially since your mum is unable to work due to her thyroid condition." "Paul, are you planning something risky? I almost lost you once," Claudia exclaimed in fear. "Why? There are so many people here, we're unlikely to be found, and if we're careful, I'm sure we can pull off something," replied Sarah, supporting Paul. Sarah had always dreamed of a luxurious life, picturing a 2-story house at the seaside, a fancy car and foreign sanatoriums for her thyroid treatment. She was indifferent about who would make her dream a reality, so one day she suggested an idea. "Claudia, what if you got closer to your boss? Of course, he isn't a handsome man, but there is an advantage because he would be honoured to have a girl like you take interest in him," she proposed. "Mum, are you suggesting I have an affair with him? Are you out of your mind?" Sarah was shocked. "What's the big issue?" Her fiancé chimed in. "It's only for a few months. We'll figure out a way to rip him off, and then we can have a good life. We could buy a house at the sea and live comfortably." "But how can you even consider that? I will not sleep with him," Claudia protested. "Claudia, you wouldn't be doing this for fun, but for our future." Paul looked at her with a reproachful stare, and she obeyed. It took a year for the girl to earn her boss's trust. There was no relationship between them yet. Paul and Sarah had meticulously planned every step, but unexpectedly Curtis appeared on the stage. "What should I do with him now?" Claudia asked her boyfriend and mother when Curtis asked her out. "Claudia, you said he's not married." Sarah's eyes lit up. "What if you lure him in and marry him?" "That's too much," Claudia protested immediately. "I love only Paul. I don't need anyone else." "Claudia, we're not going to break up. I also love only you, and after this, we can finally get married officially. For the sake of our happiness, I agree to wait and tolerate," Paul added. After the wedding, Paul stayed in the apartment they rented, while Claudia and her mother moved in with Curtis. For several years they enjoyed life, spending Curtis's money on their needs. Paul bought a nice car, and after 3 years they had a large house in the suburbs. The initial plan was to divorce Curtis after extracting everything Claudia could from him. However, the more they got from him, the more they had an appetite. Sarah had become so accustomed to the role of a house mistress that she couldn't imagine herself without a maid, cook and other helpers. Paul dressed in expensive clothes from high-end boutiques, and Claudia didn't deny herself any luxuries either. To avoid any suspicion, Paul suggested that she establish a charity fund, and most of the money she used to give to him. Besides, her work at the foundation provided her with ample spare time to spend with Paul.
"So we need to decide what's next," Sarah asked one day. "Should we stop with Curtis, or—" She cast a cunning glance at her daughter and her lover. "Or?" Paul echoed her words. "Do you aim to eliminate him so that Claudia can inherit everything?" "That would be convenient, but the question is, how do we arrange it?" She sighed. "He's not a poor man. He can't simply vanish." "Well, if everything is arranged perfectly, no one will suspect anything," Paul reassured her. Claudia didn't like the whole idea too much. She would prefer to just divorce Curtis, even if he left her without anything. They still have already taken a lot from him. But when Curtis offered her to go somewhere for the weekend, in the woman's head a cunning plan immediately arose. Go-karting seemed to her a way out. Everything proceeded better than planned. However, Curtis did not die. He was left disabled. The schemers waited a few months to avoid suspicions about Curtis's fate. After nearly 6 months, they started devising a plan to finish what they had started. This time, they decided to present the case as if Curtis had been kidnapped, injected with a heart-stopping medication, and taken to the forest. His body was planned to be found ripped up by wolves. It was mid-March and the hungry animals were prowling the forest in search of food. Everyone was so convinced of Curtis's demise that they were just waiting to find his bones. "Oh no! Mum, he's alive!" Claudia exclaimed in shock when she got the message from Curtis. With trembling hands, she called Paul. "I think no one suspected anything," he declared. "You spend the night at the hotel with Curtis. Then your mother had a heart attack and called you, which everyone saw. The EMT can confirm that. And you have that paid record from the clinic. And also, everyone saw you spending days and night near Sarah's bed at the clinic. Next, no one saw me there. It was already dark and I made sure the place was clear. The only potential problem was the cafe across the street from the hotel, but at that time it was closed. We wore masks. And none of us spoke. Plus, Curtis was most likely unconscious. The only thing I can't understand is how he survived. If his heart stopped, who brought him back to life?" Several days passed, and when Curtis did reveal his temporary hideout to Claudia, Paul immediately went after him. He had no trouble overpowering the defenceless Curtis. He led him to the basement of one of the abandoned buildings on the outskirts of the city and intended to finalize his plan the following night. "I think he won't last long in the cellar. Then we'll take him to the woods as planned. There, the wolves will finish our job." "And if he's still alive?" Curtis's wife asked in a frightened voice. "We'll take him there, alive," the man replied. "We'll leave him in the deepest part of the forest. This time it will be done properly." Curtis woke up in some dark place, lying on the floor, and felt damp. He tried to raise himself, but could not. After a while, his eyes got used to it, and he began to distinguish the walls. Apparently, it was a basement or some other underground room. Curtis felt the ground with his hands. Unable to feel his legs, he managed to lean against the wall. Who are these people? Who could have known where I was? Abby? Did she organise all this? Curtis's head throbbed with each question. Fear gripped his body as he considered the possibility. But then why would she save me? No, it couldn't have been Abby. Simon must have seen her at the factory and followed her. Or perhaps they're conspiring together. What are they going to do? Are they planning to blackmail Claudia? Claudia? She was supposed to visit me. Why didn't she come? Did I give her the wrong address? No, I told her everything right. Curtis felt the biting chill. His entire body shook from the cold. Why hasn't Claudia come? Where is she? Why didn't she save me? Suddenly a thought crashed into his consciousness like an explosive wave. Claudia knew my exact address. Could she have... Curtis froze at the implications of his thoughts. His thoughts seemed jumbled, but then clarity. My wife did this, he voiced aloud. She knew where I was. If Abby wanted to kill me, she could have taken me right here after the hospital. No one would have noticed my absence.
Accepting this reality was difficult for Curtis. It meant that from the beginning, Claudia had been pretending. She had never loved him. The thought was so painful. Curtis felt as if his heart would burst from grief. Meanwhile, Abby ran towards the police car. She was so cold she could barely speak. "Check that house. There's a big dog in the yard," the woman said in a trembling voice. "I think they've hid him there." The policeman cautiously approached the abandoned house. Despite the dogs barking, one of them climbed over the fence out of the dog's reach. The other followed. 10 minutes later they came out, holding the ends of the blanket in their hands, with Curtis lying inside it as if on a stretcher. He was taken to the hospital again, and he and Abby testified for nearly 3 hours as the police recorded everything. Eventually they summed up.
"So it turns out that no one else knew about your whereabouts except your wife."
The sergeant looked at Curtis.
"Abby also claims that she saw your wife with some man near the hotel and in the car that night. You know, we'll go back to that house. They're unlikely to appear during the day, but they'll be there in the evening or at night. We'll wait there. Please refrain from calling anyone until we have a better understanding of the situation."
The police departed, leaving Curtis and his assistant alone. The man was filled with remorse.
"Abby, I'm sorry. This is all my fault," Curtis confessed. "I initially lost my nerve and texted my wife. Then, while you were at the factory watching Simon, I phoned her and asked her to come."
"I suspected it was her from the start," the woman sighed.
"Thank goodness I found you. It's fortunate that I went directly to your house and trailed that car. You've already rescued me twice. Thank you."
Tears streamed down Curtis's face.
"You were sent by God. It was wise of me to advocate for you with Sarah and keep you. I can't imagine what would have happened if I hadn't employed you back then."
Abby looked at him. She too had endured much in these past days. She approached her employer and embraced him, prompting her own tears due to the stress. At midnight, a car pulled up to an abandoned house. 2 men emerged, one of whom threw a piece of meat to quiet a barking dog. They made their way into the house, carefully descending into the cellar. Near the entrance, a flashlight was turned on, illuminating an empty room. Startled, Paul attempted to flee the scene, only to be met by 3 policemen.
"Hands up," said one, pointing his gun. "Don't move. You won't escape."
The Curtis case had been ongoing for months, and eventually Claudia, her mother and Paul were sentenced to different terms. After Curtis returned home, his life also began to change. The first thing the man realistically looked at was his health, and since there was no positive prognosis, the man decided to sell his factory after all. Simon and another employee bought it back in installments.
"I am glad that my brainchild will belong to you," Curtis confessed to his former colleagues. "In your hands, my factory will go up. I am sure that in a few years you will achieve much more than I once did."
Despite the sadness of losing his enterprise, Curtis, after a few months, he sighed calmly. He had enough money for a long and prosperous life. But the most important thing that Curtis took out of this whole story was a reliable and loyal friend. He, as promised, fulfilled his promise.
"Abby, what do you think of this picture?"
The man stopped near the blue dancers.
"What stunning colours! I adore this painting."
Abby took Curtis's hand, their eyes drawn to the mesmerizing figures of girls in blue dresses. No longer was Curtis merely her employer. He had become a friend and cherished companion. Yet Curtis hesitated to propose to Abby, fearing she would like to find someone better than a man with disability. One day he mustered the courage to express his affection.
"Abby," Curtis began, "you mean so much to me, and I'm terrified of losing you."
"I love you, Curtis," she replied with a smile. "Let's not complicate things. If I'm dear to you, let's not invent excuses to part."
"I love you too. Will you marry me?"
Curtis blurted out.
I'll answer right away."
"Yes,"
Abby laughed. They believed that their shared trials had strengthened their bond and that no circumstances could pull them apart. Abby did everything possible to ensure Curtis never disconnected from life. They visited many places together, and when they welcomed a daughter, Curtis finally understood what it meant to have a family. "Disability only limits you when you let it," Curtis used to say. "I can confidently say that I have more opportunities than most people."